Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through history's most fascinating rebellion, the women who said no to marriage when the world demanded yes. Picture this, it's 1558, and a 25-year-old woman holds the fate of an entire empire in her hands. Kings from across Europe are literally lining up at her door, offering their kingdoms, their armies, their hearts. But she looks each one in the eye and says, "Thanks, but no thanks." This woman would go on to defeat the Spanish Armada, usher in England's golden age, and become the most powerful ruler in the world. All because she refused to walk down the aisle. How did she do it? And why did this one decision change the course of history forever? Now, before we dive into this incredible story together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. Not because I'm asking you to, but because I genuinely believe these stories will change how you see history. And hey, drop a like if you're already getting curious about tonight's journey. I'm really curious too. Where are you watching this from? Your bedroom? Maybe you're traveling? Let me know in the comments because I love connecting with fellow history lovers from around the world. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe grab that cup of tea, and let's step back in time to meet the Virgin Queen herself. Elizabeth Tudor didn't wake up one morning and decide to revolutionize monarchy. No, her path to refusing marriage began in the most traumatic way imaginable, by watching her father, Henry VIII, literally lose his head over women. Well, technically, he made other people lose their heads, including Elizabeth's own mother, Anne Boleyn. Imagine being 2 years old and learning that your father executed your mother because she couldn't give him a son. That's not exactly the kind of childhood that makes you eager to trust men with your future. But here's where Elizabeth's story gets fascinating. By 1558, when she inherited the throne, England was what we might politely call a hot mess. Her half-sister Mary had just finished burning Protestants at the stake, earning the charming nickname Bloody Mary. The treasury was emptier than a college student's bank account after spring break. Spain was flexing its muscles across Europe like the superpower it was. And Scotland? Well, let's just say they weren't exactly sending England Christmas cards. Into this chaos stepped Elizabeth, young, unmarried, and according to every political expert of her time, completely doomed. See, in the 16th century, an unmarried queen was like a smartphone without Wi-Fi, technically functional, but missing the essential connection that made everything work. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about political alliances, military protection, and producing male heirs. A queen without a husband was seen as a walking vulnerability, just waiting for some ambitious king to sweep in and take over. The marriage proposals started immediately. Philip II of Spain, who had been married to her half-sister Mary, basically slid into her DMs saying, "Hey girl, want to keep the family business going?" Eric XIV of Sweden sent ambassadors with portraits and promises of Nordic bliss. The Archduke Charles of Austria offered the full Habsburg package, land, titles, and access to the most powerful family in Europe. These weren't just marriage proposals, they were merger offers from multinational corporations of their day. But Elizabeth had been watching, learning, and most importantly, thinking. She'd seen how marriage had destroyed other queens. Her stepmother Catherine Parr had barely survived Henry VIII. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, had married for love and ended up losing her throne. Even her own sister Mary had married Philip of Spain, only to watch him treat England like a Spanish colony. Elizabeth was starting to see a pattern here, and she didn't like where it was heading. So she developed what historians now call the marriage game, a masterpiece of political theatre that would make modern diplomats weep with envy. Instead of saying no outright to her suitors, Elizabeth perfected the art of maybe. She'd invite ambassadors to court, listen to their proposals with apparent interest, then find reasons to delay. "Oh, I need to consult Parliament. The timing isn't quite right. Let me pray about this decision." She turned courtship into a chess game where she always stayed one move ahead. The brilliant part: every potential suitor who was waiting for an answer couldn't attack England. After all, you don't invade the country of your potential bride. Elizabeth had essentially created a defensive strategy out of dating. She was protecting England with the promise of her hand in marriage, without ever actually having to give it. It was like having a nuclear deterrent, except instead of missiles, she was using the possibility of a wedding dress. But this wasn't just about political manipulation. Deep down, Elizabeth understood something that her advisors didn't. Marriage would mean sharing power, and sharing power would mean losing control. In her own words, she was already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England. This wasn't just a clever soundbite. It was a revolutionary concept. She was essentially saying that her relationship with her country was more important than any relationship with a man. The pressure to marry didn't come just from foreign kings. Her own parliament, desperate for stability, regularly petitioned her to choose a husband. They'd present carefully prepared arguments about the need for heirs, the dangers of remaining single, the precedent set by other monarchs. Elizabeth would listen politely, then deliver responses that were part philosophy lecture, part royal decree, and part masterclass in deflection. She once told Parliament, "I may not be a lion, but I am a lion's cub, and I have a lion's heart." As we'll discover in our next chapter, Elizabeth's refusal to marry would lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations in European history. A showdown with the Spanish Armada that would determine whether England remained independent or became just another Spanish province. But that epic battle was still years away, and first, Elizabeth had to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, religious division, and the constant question that followed her everywhere. "Your Majesty, when will you marry?" Her answer would shock Europe and change the world forever. But long before Elizabeth was dodging marriage proposals from European royalty, there lived another woman who made an even more radical choice. Picture this. It's the year 1098, nearly 5 centuries before Elizabeth's reign, and deep in the German countryside, a 10-year-old girl is being handed over to a Benedictine monastery. Not as punishment, but as what her parents believed was the highest honor, to become a bride of Christ. This little girl would grow up to become something no one could have predicted. The world's first female scientist, composer, philosopher, and medical pioneer. Her name was Hildegard of Bingen, and she didn't just refuse marriage, she revolutionized what it meant to be a woman in medieval Europe. Now, when most of us think about life in medieval Germany, we probably imagine muddy villages, plague outbreaks, and women whose life choices were basically limited to marry young or become a nun. But Hildegard was about to shatter every single one of those expectations. While other girls her age were learning embroidery and how to manage a household, young Hildegard was experiencing what she called visions of light, mystical experiences that would later form the foundation of groundbreaking scientific theories. Here's where her story gets absolutely fascinating. At age 38, Hildegard did something that would make even modern career women pause and take notes. She convinced the male church hierarchy, arguably the most patriarchal institution in medieval Europe, to let her start her own convent. Not join someone else's convent, mind you, but create her own independent religious community where she would be the boss. Imagine walking into a medieval boardroom full of men and saying, "Thanks for the internship, guys, but I'm starting my own company now." That's essentially what Hildegard did, except her company would go on to change the course of Western knowledge. But what Hildegard accomplished next makes her monastery startup look like a warm-up act. While married women of her era were typically having their 6th or 7th child by age 40, Hildegard was writing the first comprehensive medical encyclopedia in Western history. We're talking about a 300-page masterpiece called Physica that described the healing properties of nearly 500 plants, animals, and minerals. This wasn't folk medicine passed down through generations. This was systematic, scientific observation that wouldn't look out of place in a modern botanical textbook. And here's the kicker. She was conducting original research. While university-educated male scholars were still copying ancient Greek texts and accepting them as absolute truth, Hildegard was out in her monastery gardens, actually experimenting with herbs, documenting their effects, and developing new treatments. She discovered that willow bark could reduce fever, a finding that would eventually lead to the development of aspirin, 8 centuries later. She wrote about the circulation of blood 400 years before William Harvey supposedly discovered it. She described the connection between emotional stress and physical illness in ways that sound remarkably similar to modern psychosomatic medicine. But wait, it gets even better. In her spare time, when she wasn't revolutionizing medicine, Hildegard decided to become Europe's first female composer. And we're not talking about simple church hymns here. She created complex, ethereal musical compositions that were unlike anything being written by her male contemporaries. Her music was so ahead of its time that modern musicians still struggle to categorize it. She invented new musical scales, developed innovative harmonic structures, and wrote lyrics that combined religious devotion with what can only be described as mystical poetry. One of her most famous compositions, O Successores, contains vocal leaps and melodic patterns that wouldn't become common in European music for another 200 years. When you listen to her music today, and yes, you can find it on Spotify, it sounds almost otherworldly, like it's channeling something from beyond the medieval world. Medieval music scholars often joke that Hildegard was composing Renaissance music before the Renaissance even knew it wanted to exist. Now, here's where Hildegard's rejection of traditional marriage becomes absolutely crucial to understanding her achievements. See, in medieval society, a married woman's time, energy, and intellectual output legally belonged to her husband. Even if she had brilliant ideas, any inventions, writings, or discoveries would be credited to her spouse. By choosing monastic life over marriage, Hildegard had essentially hacked the medieval system. She'd found the one socially acceptable way for a woman to maintain intellectual independence and legal autonomy. But she didn't stop at personal freedom. She used her position to advocate for other women. In her letters to emperors, popes, and kings, yes, she regularly corresponded with the most powerful people in Europe. Hildegard argued that women possessed unique spiritual insights that were essential for society's well-being. She essentially told the medieval world that excluding women from intellectual life wasn't just unfair, it was stupid. This was a woman who once wrote to the Pope himself, criticizing church corruption and demanding reforms. Imagine getting a strongly worded email from a medieval nun calling out the Vatican for poor management. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of her monastery. Kings and queens would travel hundreds of miles to consult with her on matters of state. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa sought her advice on political strategy. She conducted what we might recognize today as international diplomacy, mediating disputes between powerful rulers and religious leaders. All of this while maintaining that she was just a simple, uneducated woman receiving divine visions. It was either the most elaborate case of imposter syndrome in history or the most brilliant PR strategy ever devised. Perhaps most remarkably, Hildegard lived to be 81 years old, an absolutely extraordinary age for the 12th century, when most people were lucky to see 40. she remained intellectually active until the very end, continuing to write, compose, and advise rulers well into her 70s. She attributed her longevity to a systematic approach to health and wellness, which she documented in detailed treatises that read like early versions of holistic medicine textbooks. The tragedy is that most of Hildegard's scientific work was largely forgotten after her death, dismissed by later male scholars who couldn't believe that a medieval woman could have made such groundbreaking discoveries. It wasn't until the 20th century that researchers began to seriously study her contributions and realize just how far ahead of her time she really was. And yet, Hildegard represents something profound about the power of choosing independence over conventional expectations. She took the limited options available to medieval women and transformed them into launching pads for unprecedented achievement. She proved that refusing traditional marriage didn't mean refusing to contribute to society. Sometimes it meant contributing in ways that were impossible within conventional structures. As we'll see next, this pattern of brilliant women choosing unconventional paths would repeat throughout history. But our next story takes us to early 20th century France, where a young woman would make a decision that seems almost opposite to Hildegard's monastic choice. She would reject not just marriage, but the entire concept of how women should dress, behave, and present themselves to the world. Her rebellion would literally reshape fashion forever and create one of the most powerful brands in modern history. Sometimes the most revolutionary acts come disguised as simple choices. While Hildegard was transforming medieval scholarship from her monastery, another kind of rebellion was brewing centuries later in the most unlikely place imaginable, a French orphanage. The year was 1883, and a little girl named Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel had just watched her mother die of tuberculosis. Her father, overwhelmed and unable to cope, did what many men of his era considered acceptable. He abandoned his children at a convent orphanage and disappeared forever. Most girls in Gabriel's situation would have grown up to accept whatever marriage offered them as an escape from poverty. But this particular little girl would grow up to become Coco Chanel, and she had very different plans for her future. What's absolutely fascinating about Coco's story is how her traumatic childhood accidentally prepared her to revolutionize women's fashion. Picture this. While wealthy girls her age were learning to lace themselves into corsets and navigate the elaborate rituals of high society courtship, Coco was learning to sew in a convent, surrounded by nuns who wore simple, practical black and white habits. She was absorbing lessons in minimalism, functionality, and the power of understated elegance without even realizing it. Those nuns, in their own way, were teaching her that women could be powerful without being ornamental. By age 18, Coco had become what the French politely called a grisette, a working-class seamstress who supplemented her income by entertaining gentlemen. But here's where her story takes an unexpected turn. While other young women in her position were desperately seeking wealthy husbands to rescue them from poverty, Coco was making a completely different calculation. She was studying these wealthy men, learning how they lived, understanding the source of their power, and she was deciding she wanted that power for herself, not as someone's wife, but as someone's equal. Her first real opportunity came through Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who became her lover. Now, in the typical fairy tale version of this story, Coco would have charmed Etienne into marriage and lived happily ever after as a wealthy man's wife. But Coco looked at Etienne's lifestyle and thought, I can do better than this. She moved into his chateau, not as his intended bride, but as his mistress, a position that gave her access to high society without the legal constraints of marriage. It was a brilliant strategic move that modern business schools would probably call maintaining optionality while securing market access. But what Coco did next was pure genius. Instead of trying to fit into the elaborate fashion world of the Belle Époque, she started dismantling it piece by piece. The first thing she noticed was how absolutely ridiculous women's fashion had become. We're talking about the era of the S-curve silhouette, where women wore corsets so tight they literally couldn't breathe properly. Skirts were so massive they required steel cage crinolines underneath. Hats were so enormous they needed hat pins the size of small swords to stay in place. Getting dressed was like preparing for battle, and moving around once dressed was like navigating an obstacle course. Coco took one look at this fashion madness and said essentially, "This is stupid." While living at Etienne's chateau, she started borrowing his clothes: simple sweaters, comfortable trousers, practical jackets. She began wearing them around his estate, and something magical happened. She looked effortlessly elegant in a way that no amount of corsetry and crinoline could achieve. She was accidentally discovering what would become her signature style, the radical idea that women could be beautiful without being uncomfortable. The breakthrough moment came when Coco started making hats. Now, you might think, how revolutionary can hat making be? But remember, this was an era when women's hats were basically architectural projects involving feathers, flowers, ribbons, and enough decorative elements to stock a small craft store. Coco's hats were different. Clean lines, minimal decoration, designed to actually flatter a woman's face rather than overwhelm it. They were so strikingly simple that they stood out like modern art in a room full of Victorian clutter. Her hat business took off like wildfire, but what's really interesting is how she leveraged that success. Instead of using her growing wealth to attract a wealthy husband, Coco doubled down on her independence. She opened her first boutique at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris in 1910, using money she'd saved from her hat sales and a loan from her new lover, Boy Capel. But here's the crucial detail. She maintained complete creative and financial control. She wasn't a silent partner or a decorative figurehead. She was the boss. And boy, did she boss. Coco's designs began challenging every assumption about women's fashion. She introduced jersey fabric, previously used only for men's underwear, into high fashion because it was comfortable and moved with the body. She created the first little black dress in 1926, which Vogue called Chanel's Ford, a simple, elegant design that every woman could wear and make her own. She popularized costume jewelry, arguing that women should be able to afford beautiful accessories without bankrupting themselves or depending on a man's generosity. But perhaps her most radical innovation was the Chanel suit, a simple, elegant jacket and skirt combination that allowed women to move freely while still looking professionally polished. This might not sound revolutionary to us today, but in the 1920s, it was basically the equivalent of inventing business casual 50 years before anyone else thought of it. She was designing clothes for the women she saw emerging around her. Working women, independent women, women who needed to move through the world with confidence and comfort. What made Coco's approach so different was her understanding of the psychological power of clothing. She once said, "Fashion fades, but style is eternal." She understood that true elegance came from confidence, not complexity. While other designers were creating elaborate costumes that essentially turned women into decorative objects, Coco was designing clothes that helped women feel powerful and authentic. The irony, of course, is that Coco achieved all of this while maintaining relationships with some of the most powerful men in Europe. She had affairs with the Duke of Westminster, collaborated with artists like Picasso and Stravinsky, and moved through high society as an equal, not as an accessory. She proved that a woman could have romantic relationships without sacrificing her independence or professional identity. She was essentially pioneering what we might now recognize as modern dating, maintaining autonomy while enjoying partnership. By the 1920s, Coco Chanel had built an empire that employed over 4,000 people, and was making her one of the wealthiest women in the world. She owned properties in Paris, the French Riviera, and Switzerland. She was financially independent on a scale that would have been unimaginable for most women of her generation. And she'd done it all without ever walking down the aisle. Her success wasn't just personal. It was transformational for women everywhere. She'd proven that women could be entrepreneurs, creative directors, and business leaders. She'd shown that comfort and elegance weren't mutually exclusive. Most importantly, she demonstrated that a woman's worth wasn't determined by her ability to attract and keep a husband, but by her ability to create, innovate, and lead. The ripple effects of Coco's rebellion continue to this day. Every time a woman puts on a comfortable pair of pants instead of a restrictive skirt, she's benefiting from Coco's revolution. Every time someone chooses simple elegance over elaborate decoration, they're following in Coco's footsteps. She didn't just change fashion, she changed the conversation about what women could be and do. But while Coco was revolutionizing how women dressed and thought about themselves, another remarkable woman was quietly transforming how women understood love, relationships, and social expectations. Our next story takes us to the drawing rooms of Regency England, where a country parson's daughter would use her sharp wit and keen observations to write novels that would make her one of the most beloved authors in history. The twist? She chose to remain single in an era when marriage was considered a woman's only path to security and respectability. There's something deliciously ironic about a woman who never married becoming history's greatest expert on love and marriage. While Coco Chanel was busy freeing women from their corsets in Paris, let's travel back to Hampshire, England, where a quiet country parson's daughter had already figured out something profound about human nature. Her name was Jane Austen, and she possessed what might be the most dangerous weapon in Georgian England. A razor-sharp wit combined with the ability to see through social pretense like it was made of glass. The woman who would give us Elizabeth Bennet, Emma Woodhouse, and some of literature's most memorable love stories chose to remain single her entire life. And that choice, it made all the difference. Jane's story begins in 1775 in the Hampshire countryside, where she was born into what we might generously call the genteel poor, a family with social status but very little money to back it up. Her father, George Austen, was a country rector who supplemented his modest income by tutoring boys and farming. The Austen household was intellectually rich but financially precarious, which gave Jane a front-row seat to observe the economic realities that drove Georgian society's obsession with marriage. She watched as families strategized about which daughters should marry which men, not for love, but for financial survival. This early exposure to the marriage market's brutal economics would become the foundation of Jane's literary genius. She understood, perhaps better than any writer before or since, that for women of her era, choosing a husband was like playing a high-stakes poker game where the cards were stacked against you. One wrong move, and you could end up trapped in a loveless marriage with a man who controlled every aspect of your life. Make no move at all, and you risked ending up as an impoverished spinster dependent on relatives' charity. But here's where Jane's story gets fascinating. She actually had opportunities to escape this dilemma through marriage. In 1802, when she was 27, practically an old maid by Georgian standards, she received a proposal from Harris Bigwither, a wealthy landowner who could have solved all her financial worries. He wasn't particularly handsome or charming, but he was rich and respectable. Jane initially accepted his proposal, probably thinking practically about her future security, but then she did something extraordinary. She changed her mind overnight and broke off the engagement the next morning. Imagine the scandal! This wasn't just rejecting a suitor. This was walking away from financial security, social respectability, and the chance to have her own household. Her family must have thought she'd lost her mind, but Jane had realized something crucial. She would rather face uncertainty as a single woman than certainty as an unhappy wife. It was a decision that would cost her financial comfort, but give her something far more valuable: complete creative freedom. This rejection wasn't born from naivety about love and marriage. Jane had also experienced real romantic attraction earlier in her life. Around 1795, she'd met Tom Lefroy, a charming Irish law student who was visiting Hampshire. Their flirtation was intense enough that Jane's letters from the time sparkle with wit and genuine affection. She wrote to her sister Cassandra about Tom with a playfulness that suggests real attraction. "I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together." But Tom's family, recognizing that Jane had no fortune to offer, quickly whisked him away to London and eventually arranged a more financially advantageous marriage for him. This experience gave Jane intimate knowledge of how economic considerations could destroy genuine affection. Knowledge she would later pour into novels like Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. What's remarkable is how Jane transformed these personal disappointments into literary gold. Instead of becoming bitter about the marriage market's constraints, she became its most astute chronicler and critic. Her novels work like sophisticated insider trading reports from the Georgian marriage market, exposing the calculations, manipulations, and genuine emotions that drove the system. She understood that while society claimed marriage was about love and romance, it was actually about economics, social status, and power dynamics. Take Elizabeth Bennet's rejection of Mr. Darcy's first proposal in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth doesn't reject Darcy because she doesn't need marriage for financial security. She's well aware that her family's modest fortune means she'll likely need to marry for economic reasons. She rejects him because she refuses to accept a marriage based on his social superiority and her grateful submission. Elizabeth demands to be chosen as an equal, not rescued as a charity case. This was a revolutionary concept in 1813, and it came directly from Jane's own insistence on maintaining her dignity and autonomy. But Jane wasn't just writing romance novels. She was conducting sophisticated social analysis disguised as entertainment. Her books reveal the economic pressures that forced women into marriages with men they didn't love, the social mechanisms that kept women dependent and powerless, and the rare circumstances under which genuine partnership might be possible. She was essentially writing feminist economic theory, but packaging it so cleverly that even the most traditional readers could enjoy it. The genius of Jane's approach was her use of irony and humor to make serious points about women's limited options. When she wrote that "it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," she was actually saying something much more pointed. That society was organized around the assumption that wealthy men needed wives, while completely ignoring what women might want or need. Her opening line is a perfect example of her ability to expose social hypocrisy while appearing to simply tell an entertaining story. Jane's decision to remain single gave her something no married woman of her era could have: complete control over her creative output. Married women in Georgian England had no legal rights to their own earnings. Any money Jane made from her novels would have legally belonged to her husband had she married. By staying single, she maintained ownership of her work and, crucially, the freedom to write exactly what she wanted without worrying about her husband's approval or disapproval. This creative freedom allowed Jane to develop what literary scholars now recognize as one of the most sophisticated narrative techniques in English literature: free indirect discourse. This technique lets readers access characters' thoughts and emotions while maintaining narrative distance, creating an intimate yet objective perspective that was revolutionary for its time. She could reveal the inner lives of her female characters with unprecedented depth and complexity, because she understood those inner lives from her own experience of navigating society as an independent woman. The financial reality of Jane's choice wasn't easy. She lived modestly with her family, dependent on her father's income and later her brother's support. She had to be careful about expenses, couldn't travel freely, and faced the constant social awkwardness of being an unmarried woman in a world that didn't quite know what to do with such creatures. But she also had something that married women of her era rarely possessed: time to think, write, and observe without the demands of managing a household and raising children. Jane's novels became bestsellers during her lifetime, though they were published anonymously as by a lady. The financial success of her books gave her a small measure of independence, proving that a woman could, under very specific circumstances, support herself through her own talent and work. She was quietly demonstrating that alternatives to marriage existed, even if they required exceptional skill and a fair amount of luck. Perhaps most importantly, Jane's single status allowed her to write about marriage from a position of choice rather than necessity. Because she wasn't desperate to marry, she could afford to be honest about marriage's limitations and possibilities. Her married characters aren't automatically happy, and her single characters aren't automatically miserable. She understood that fulfillment came from authenticity, integrity, and genuine connection. Things that could exist within marriage but weren't guaranteed by it. The irony is beautiful. The woman who never married created some of literature's most beloved love stories precisely because she understood love from a position of freedom rather than desperation. Her heroines demand partnerships based on mutual respect and genuine affection because Jane herself refused to settle for anything less in her own life. As we move forward in our journey through history, we'll encounter another woman who made a similar choice, but in a completely different context. Our next story takes us to 19th century Poland, where a young woman would face an even more dramatic version of Jane's dilemma: sacrifice her intellectual ambitions for marriage and security, or risk everything to pursue scientific discovery in a world that barely acknowledged women's existence in academic circles. What happens when a brilliant woman's hunger for knowledge collides with her society's expectations? While Jane Austen was crafting her witty social commentaries in the English countryside, across Europe in Russian-controlled Poland, a young girl named Maria Salomea Skłodowska was about to face an impossible choice. Born in 1867 into a family of Polish patriots who had lost their fortune fighting for independence, Maria would grow up to become Marie Curie, the most famous female scientist in history. But before she became a Nobel Prize winner, before she discovered radium, before she changed science forever, she had to make a decision that would define her entire life. Would she accept a traditional marriage and the security it offered, or would she risk everything to pursue her dangerous obsession with the invisible forces of the universe? Maria's story begins in Warsaw, where her father, Władysław Skłodowski, was a mathematics and physics teacher whose Polish patriotism had cost him prestigious teaching positions. Her mother, Bronisława, ran a prestigious boarding school for girls until the Russian authorities shut it down for promoting Polish culture. So Maria grew up in a household where education was revered, Polish independence was a sacred cause, and the family had literally sacrificed their financial security for their principles. It was the perfect environment to produce a woman who would later choose scientific discovery over personal comfort. The tragic irony of Maria's childhood was that she was brilliant in a time and place where brilliant women had almost nowhere to go. The University of Warsaw didn't admit women. In fact, no university in Russian-controlled Poland admitted women. For a girl with Maria's intellectual gifts, this was like being a natural-born swimmer told that all the pools in the world were off-limits. She could see the water, she knew she could excel in it. but society had placed barriers that seemed impossible to overcome. So Maria did something that reveals her character perfectly. She joined an underground educational movement called the Flying University. This was a secret network of Polish scholars who held clandestine classes in private homes, constantly moving locations to avoid Russian authorities. Students risked imprisonment just for attending these illegal lectures. Maria spent her late teens attending physics and chemistry classes in basement apartments and hidden rooms, learning advanced science while keeping one eye on the door in case the Russian police arrived. But here's where Maria's path becomes truly extraordinary. At age 18, she made a pact with her older sister Bronya that would change both their lives. They agreed to take turns supporting each other's education abroad. Bronya would go to Paris first to study medicine, while Maria worked as a governess to earn money for Bronya's expenses. Then, when Bronya graduated and could support herself, Maria would get her turn to study in Paris. This meant Maria spent 3 years working as a governess for wealthy families, often in remote countryside locations where she was isolated from intellectual stimulation. But here's what's fascinating. During this period, she received marriage proposals from respectable men who could have provided her with comfortable conventional lives. The most serious came from the eldest son of her employers, the Żurawski family. Young Kazimierz Żurawski was studying agriculture in Warsaw. He was kind, intelligent, and he genuinely cared for Maria. More importantly, marrying him would have meant financial security and social respectability. Maria was tempted. The life of a governess was lonely and poorly paid, and she had no guarantee that her dream of studying science would ever materialize. Kazimierz offered her immediate escape from uncertainty. They even became unofficially engaged. But then something happened that revealed the true nature of 19th century society. Kazimierz's parents absolutely forbade the marriage. Why? Because Maria was poor, socially inferior, and just a governess. The family threatened to disinherit their son if he married beneath his station. This rejection could have crushed Maria's spirit. Instead, it crystallized her determination. She realized that even if she married well, her worth would always be determined by her husband's status, not her own achievements. The Żurawski family's rejection became her liberation. She wrote to her sister, "I couldn't believe that such a beautiful thing could be destroyed so easily. But I've literally torn my heart out and put it to sleep. One must forget everything personal." In 1891, at age 24, Maria finally made it to Paris to study at the Sorbonne. She enrolled under the French version of her name, Marie, and threw herself into her studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She rented a tiny 6th-floor garret in the Latin Quarter that was so cold in winter that water froze in her wash basin. She often survived on bread, butter and tea because she was spending every spare franc on laboratory equipment and textbooks. But here's what makes Marie's sacrifice so remarkable. She wasn't just studying for personal fulfillment, she was essentially conducting a radical experiment in human potential. Every equation she mastered, every lab experiment she completed, every exam she passed was proof that women could excel in the most demanding intellectual pursuits. She was testing the hypothesis that genius has no gender, and her success or failure would impact not just her own future, but the future of women's education everywhere. The results were spectacular. Marie graduated first in her physics degree and second in her mathematics degree. But more importantly, she had caught the attention of the French scientific establishment. Professor Gabriel Lippmann offered her a research project studying the magnetic properties of steel, work that required advanced mathematical skills and precise experimental techniques. This wasn't just academic success, it was professional recognition in a field that had never taken women seriously. It was during this research project that Marie met Pierre Curie, a brilliant physicist 8 years her senior who was already established in French scientific circles. Their first meeting was arranged by a mutual colleague who thought Pierre might have laboratory space for Marie's steel magnetism research. What happened next has become one of science's great love stories, but it's important to understand that this wasn't love at first sight. It was intellectual attraction at first conversation. Pierre later wrote that he was struck by Marie's preoccupied expression, her obvious passion for scientific problems, and her complete lack of interest in social conventions. Here was a woman who talked about physics the way other people talked about the weather, naturally, enthusiastically, and with deep understanding. For Pierre, who devoted his life to science, never married because he couldn't find a woman who shared his intellectual passions, meeting Marie was like discovering a new element. But here's the crucial detail that makes Marie's story different from a typical romance. She initially resisted Pierre's attentions because she was planning to return to Poland after completing her research. She had convinced herself that her duty was to go back and teach Polish women, to help her homeland develop its scientific capabilities. She saw her Paris education as preparation for service to Poland, not as the beginning of a French career. Pierre's courtship was unlike anything in romantic literature, because it was conducted entirely through scientific discussions and collaborative research. He didn't send flowers. He invited her to discuss crystallography. He didn't write love poems. He shared his theories about symmetry in physics. He proposed marriage by arguing that they could accomplish more together than separately, that their combined scientific capabilities would unlock discoveries neither could achieve alone. What's remarkable is how Marie approached this decision. She didn't see marriage to Pierre as choosing love over ambition. She saw it as choosing a partnership that would amplify both their scientific capabilities. In her letters to her sister, she wrote that Pierre was a true gift of heaven, not because he was romantic, but because he understood her scientific passions and could support them. She was essentially inventing a new model of marriage, partnership based on shared intellectual goals rather than traditional gender roles. Their wedding in 1895 was perfectly in character. A simple civil ceremony followed by a bicycle honeymoon through the French countryside, during which they discussed physics problems and collected mineral samples. Marie wore a dark blue dress because, as she noted practically, it wouldn't show laboratory stains as easily as white. Even their honeymoon was a scientific expedition disguised as a romantic getaway. But what's most significant about Marie's early years is how her rejection of conventional marriage expectations in Poland prepared her for this unconventional partnership in France. Because she'd refused to settle for marriage as escape from poverty or social advancement, she was free to choose marriage as intellectual collaboration. Because she'd developed her identity as a scientist before becoming a wife, she could maintain that identity within marriage. The partnership worked brilliantly. Together, Marie and Pierre would discover radium and polonium, pioneering the field of radioactivity that would transform both physics and medicine. But their success came from the foundation Marie had built during her single years. Her rigorous scientific training, her ability to work independently, and her determination to be valued for her mind rather than her social status. Marie's early choices prove something profound about the relationship between independence and partnership. Her years of refusing marriage proposals and choosing education over security weren't just preparation for scientific discovery. They were preparation for a marriage of true equals. Because she'd learned to value herself as a scientist, she could enter marriage from a position of strength rather than desperation. But our next story takes us to America, where another remarkable woman would face a different version of Marie's dilemma. In the mid-19th century, when the women's rights movement was just beginning to take shape, one woman would choose to dedicate her entire life to securing voting rights for women. Her decision to remain single wasn't about personal fulfillment or scientific ambition. It was about political revolution. Across the Atlantic, while Marie Curie was discovering radioactive elements in her Parisian laboratory, another kind of revolution was brewing in the small town of Addams, Massachusetts. The year was 1820, and a baby girl named Susan Brownell Anthony had just been born into a Quaker family that would teach her something radical: that women and men were spiritual equals in the eyes of God. What Susan didn't know yet was that this simple religious principle would put her on a collision course with American society, leading her to make a choice that would shock her contemporaries and change the course of history. She would reject not just marriage, but the entire idea that a woman's highest calling was to serve as wife and mother. Instead, she would dedicate her life to something that most people considered impossible: securing the right for women to vote. Susan's story reveals something fascinating about how revolutionary ideas can emerge from the most unexpected places. Her father, Daniel Anthony, wasn't a radical activist. He was a cotton mill owner and devout Quaker who simply believed in treating people fairly. Quaker tradition held that women could speak in religious meetings, lead prayers, and offer spiritual guidance just like men. For little Susan, growing up in this environment, the idea that women had valuable opinions worth hearing wasn't revolutionary. It was just normal life. But as Susan grew older, she began to notice a disturbing pattern. The spiritual equality she experienced in Quaker meetings didn't extend to the world outside her religious community. Women couldn't vote, couldn't own property after marriage, couldn't attend most colleges, and had no legal rights to their own children if their husbands chose to take them away. The contrast was so stark it was almost surreal. Women could apparently receive divine inspiration and lead souls to salvation, but they couldn't be trusted to mark a ballot or make legal decisions about their own lives. Susan's awakening came gradually through her work as a teacher. At age 17, she took a position at a boarding school where she earned $2.50 a week, exactly 1/4 of what her male colleagues earned for the same work. When she questioned this disparity, she was told that men needed higher salaries because they had families to support. The logic was circular and infuriating. Women earned less because they were expected to marry and be supported by husbands, but if they didn't marry, they were still paid less because the assumption was that they eventually would marry. But what really radicalized Susan was witnessing the legal helplessness of married women. She watched as intelligent, capable women lost all legal identity the moment they said, "I do." Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman became a femme covert, literally a covered woman, whose legal existence was entirely subsumed by her husband's. She couldn't sign contracts, couldn't own property, couldn't keep her own earnings, and couldn't even make a will without her husband's permission. Marriage, Susan realized, was essentially a form of legal slavery disguised as romantic fulfillment. The breaking point came in 1851 when Susan met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a brilliant writer and activist who had organized the first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls 3 years earlier. Elizabeth was married with several children, but she was also frustrated by the limitations that marriage placed on her activism. She had the ideas and the writing skills to advance women's rights, but she was often trapped at home by domestic responsibilities. Susan, meanwhile, was single and mobile, but lacked Elizabeth's intellectual connections and writing talent. Their partnership was like a perfect political marriage. Elizabeth would write the speeches and Susan would deliver them, travelling across the country to spread their message. But for this partnership to work, Susan had to make a crucial decision. She had to choose activism over marriage. This wasn't just a career choice. It was a complete rejection of society's fundamental assumptions about women's purpose in life. The personal cost of this decision was enormous. Susan received numerous marriage proposals throughout her 20s and 30s, including at least one from a man she genuinely cared for. but she had seen too much to believe that marriage could coexist with the kind of activism she felt called to pursue. She once wrote to a friend, "I never felt I could give up my life of freedom to become a man's housekeeper. When I was young, if a girl married poor, she became a housekeeper and a drudge. If she married wealthy, she became a pet and a doll." Susan's rejection of marriage wasn't motivated by man-hating or fear of intimacy. It was a strategic decision based on cold political calculation. She understood that the women's rights movement needed someone who could travel constantly, speak at controversial gatherings, risk arrest and social ostracism, and maintain complete focus on the cause. A married woman with children simply couldn't take those risks without devastating consequences for her family. The genius of Susan's approach was how she turned her single status into a political weapon. When critics attacked the women's rights movement by claiming that its leaders were bitter spinsters who couldn't find husbands, Susan would respond with devastating logic. She would point out that if marriage was so wonderful for women, why did the law need to strip them of all legal rights the moment they entered it? If wives were so cherished and protected, why couldn't they own property or control their own earnings? Susan's activism wasn't limited to genteel letter writing or polite petition drives. She was a master of what we would now recognize as civil disobedience and publicity stunts. In 1872, she committed an act that made headlines across America. She voted illegally in the presidential election. She wasn't trying to hide her identity or sneak past election officials. She walked into her polling place in Rochester, New York, registered to vote, and cast her ballot while reporters watched. The aftermath was exactly what Susan had planned. She was arrested 2 weeks later, creating a national news story about women's voting rights. During her trial, she delivered a speech that became legendary in the suffrage movement. "I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution." The judge, clearly flustered by Susan's eloquence and legal arguments, tried to silence her by imposing a fine of $100, a substantial sum in 1872. Susan's response was perfect. "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty." She never did pay the fine, and the government never tried to collect it, probably because they didn't want to create a martyr by imprisoning a middle-aged Quaker woman for exercising what she claimed were her constitutional rights. But Susan's most brilliant tactical innovation was her understanding of how to use her single status to shame married men into supporting women's rights. She would point out that if women were truly the weaker sex who needed male protection, then surely they deserved legal protections that would prevent abusive husbands from stealing their property or wages. If women were the moral guardians of society, surely they deserved a voice in creating laws that would protect children and families. Susan's arguments were particularly effective because they exposed the contradictions in Victorian gender ideology. Society claimed that women were naturally pure, moral, and nurturing, but then denied them any legal power to act on those supposedly natural inclinations. Susan would ask audiences, "If women are naturally more moral than men, why are we excluded from making laws? If we're naturally more nurturing, why can't we vote to protect children from dangerous working conditions?" The personal sacrifice required for Susan's activism was staggering. She spent 50 years travelling constantly, often staying in uncomfortable accommodations, facing hostile crowds, and dealing with financial insecurity. She was arrested multiple times, burned in effigy, and regularly received death threats. She watched many of her contemporaries marry, have children, and build comfortable domestic lives while she remained focused on a goal that seemed impossibly distant. But Susan understood something profound about social change. It requires people willing to sacrifice personal happiness for future generations' benefit. She once wrote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." These words wouldn't become the 19th Amendment until 1920, 14 years after Susan's death. She spent her entire adult life fighting for something she knew she might never live to see. Perhaps most remarkably, Susan maintained her sense of humour and optimism despite the enormous challenges she faced. When people asked her if she regretted never marrying or having children, she would respond that she had helped birth a movement that would benefit millions of daughters she would never meet. She saw her single life not as a sacrifice, but as a different kind of motherhood, nurturing the growth of women's political power rather than individual children. Susan's legacy proves something important about the relationship between personal choices and political change. Her decision to remain single wasn't just about her individual freedom. It was about creating space for a movement that would transform American democracy. Because she chose activism over marriage, millions of women gained the right to choose both. But while Susan was fighting for women's political rights in America, another remarkable woman was pushing the boundaries of artistic expression in ways that would revolutionize how we see the natural world. Our next story takes us to the American Southwest, where a painter would choose artistic integrity over social expectations, creating works that would challenge both artistic conventions and gender roles. Art has always been a language of rebellion, and no one spoke it more fluently than Georgia Toto O'Keeffe. While Susan B. Anthony was fighting for women's political voices in crowded lecture halls, a young woman born in 1887 on a Wisconsin dairy farm was quietly preparing to revolutionize how America saw both art and femininity. Georgia O'Keeffe would become famous for painting flowers so intimately that viewers couldn't help but see them as something more than botanical studies. But her most radical act wasn't what she painted, it was how she chose to live. In an era when women artists were expected to be either struggling bohemians or wealthy hobbyists, Georgia carved out a third path, the successful independent artist who answered to no one but her own creative vision. Georgia's artistic rebellion began early, but not in the way you might expect. Growing up on a 600-acre farm near Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, she was surrounded by the kind of vast, open landscapes that would later define her most famous works. But her first artistic education came from her mother Ida, who'd given up her own artistic ambitions to marry and raise 7 children. Ida made sure all her daughters received art lessons, but there was something different about Georgia's relationship with colour and form. While her sisters dutifully copied flowers and landscapes from art instruction books, Georgia was experimenting with abstraction before she even knew what the word meant. The turning point came when Georgia was studying at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1905. She was 18 years old, talented and completely disillusioned with traditional art education. Her professors were teaching students to copy European masters, to paint pretty pictures that would sell well in galleries, to essentially become artistic manufacturers rather than creative innovators. Georgia looked at this conventional path and felt something that would drive her entire career, a complete rejection of artistic compromise. But here's where Georgia's story becomes fascinating. She didn't rebel by becoming a struggling artist in a garret. Instead, she became a teacher. For nearly a decade, she taught art in schools across Texas, Virginia, and South Carolina, supporting herself financially while secretly developing her own revolutionary artistic vision. She was essentially living a double life, respectable art teacher by day, experimental modernist by night. During this teaching period, Georgia made a decision that would change American art forever. She decided to completely abandon everything she'd been taught about what art should look like. In 1915, while teaching in Columbia, South Carolina, she created a series of abstract charcoal drawings that were unlike anything being produced in America at the time. These weren't pretty pictures or realistic representations. They were pure expressions of emotion and energy, translated into flowing lines and organic forms. What makes these drawings so remarkable is that Georgia created them in complete isolation from the European avant-garde movement that was revolutionizing art in Paris. She wasn't copying Picasso or Kandinsky. She was arriving at abstraction through her own intuitive understanding of how visual forms could express inner experiences. She was proving that artistic innovation didn't require European training or bohemian lifestyle. Sometimes it just required the courage to trust your own vision. Georgia sent these drawings to a friend in New York who showed them to Alfred Stieglitz, the most influential photographer and gallery owner in America. Stieglitz's reaction was immediate and intense. He declared that these were the first genuinely American abstract artworks he had ever seen. In 1916, without Georgia's permission, he included her work in a group show at his famous 291 gallery. Georgia was furious about this unauthorized exhibition, but it launched her career in the most dramatic way possible. The relationship between Georgia and Alfred would become one of the art history's most complicated partnerships. Alfred was 23 years older than Georgia, already famous as a photographer, and married to another woman when they met. Their relationship began as artistic collaboration. He photographed her, she inspired his work, and he promoted her paintings with an intensity that bordered on obsession. But this wasn't a traditional romance, and Georgia made sure of that. When Alfred finally divorced his wife and married Georgia in 1924, she set terms that were revolutionary for their time. She insisted on keeping her own name professionally, remaining Georgia O'Keeffe rather than becoming Mrs. Stieglitz. She maintained her own bank accounts, controlled her own career decisions, and refused to be seen simply as the wife of a famous photographer. Most importantly, she demanded the right to paint whatever she wanted, however she wanted, without interference from her husband or the art market. This independence wasn't just symbolic. It was financial and creative freedom that allowed Georgia to develop her most famous body of work. Starting in the 1920s, she began painting her iconic flower studies, massive close-up views of irises, poppies and orchids that filled entire canvases with sensual curves and vibrant colours. These paintings were immediately controversial because many viewers saw them as sexual imagery disguised as botanical studies. Georgia was endlessly frustrated by these interpretations. She insisted that she was simply painting flowers as she saw them, magnified, abstracted, and stripped of unnecessary detail to reveal their essential beauty. When critics kept insisting that her flowers were really about female sexuality, Georgia would respond with characteristic directness. "Well, I made you take time to look at what I saw, and when you took time to really notice my flower, you hung all your own associations with flowers on my flower, and you write about my flower as if I think and see what you think and see of the flower, and I don't." But here's what's brilliant about Georgia's approach. Whether or not her flowers were intentionally sexual, they were undeniably powerful. She was taking subjects that had traditionally been considered feminine and decorative, flowers, landscapes, domestic objects, and transforming them into monumental, commanding artworks. She was proving that there was no such thing as inherently masculine or feminine subject matter in art, only strong and weak artistic vision. Georgia's success allowed her to make choices that would have been impossible for earlier generations of women artists. In 1929, at age 42, she made a decision that shocked both the art world and her husband. She began spending summers alone in New Mexico, leaving Alfred behind in New York. This wasn't a marital separation. It was a creative necessity. Georgia had discovered that the stark landscapes and intense light of the Southwest inspired her in ways that the crowded art scene of New York never could. These solo trips to New Mexico weren't comfortable artistic retreats. Georgia would drive herself across the desert in a Model A Ford, camping alone under the stars, hiking for hours to find the perfect painting subjects. She was essentially becoming an artistic pioneer, exploring both geographical and creative territories that no woman had claimed before. She painted massive landscapes that captured the spiritual intensity of the American West, skull studies that turned death into abstract beauty, and architectural portraits of adobe churches that revealed the sacred in the everyday. The physical demands of Georgia's New Mexico work were extraordinary. She would wake before dawn to catch the perfect light, hike miles carrying her painting equipment, and work for hours in temperatures that could reach over 100 degrees. She was proving that serious artistic work required physical courage and endurance, not just creative sensitivity. She was redefining what it meant to be a woman artist, moving from the stereotype of the delicate flower painter to the reality of the tough, independent creator. Georgia's marriage to Alfred eventually evolved into a long-distance relationship that worked precisely because it gave both artists the space they needed for their individual work. Alfred remained in New York, photographing and running his galleries, while Georgia spent increasing amounts of time in New Mexico, developing the body of work that would make her one of America's most recognizable artists. They maintained their emotional connection while pursuing separate creative paths, a model of artistic marriage that was decades ahead of its time. By the 1940s, Georgia had achieved something that was almost unthinkable for a woman artist: complete creative and financial independence. She was selling paintings for thousands of dollars, receiving major museum exhibitions, and being recognized as one of America's most important artists. She had proven that a woman could succeed in the art world without compromising her vision or depending on male patrons for validation. But perhaps most importantly, Georgia had created a new archetype, the woman artist as independent force of nature. She wasn't the suffering artist in the garret, she wasn't the wealthy dilettante, and she wasn't the artist's wife who painted on the side. She was the professional artist who happened to be a woman, and who refused to let gender determine either her subject matter or her lifestyle. Georgia's influence extended far beyond her own artwork. She was proving that women could claim the American landscape as artistic territory, that they could work alone without fear, and that they could create art that was both commercially successful and artistically groundbreaking. She was opening doors that future generations of women artists would walk through with confidence. After Alfred's death in 1946, Georgia made her most dramatic move yet. She permanently relocated to New Mexico, buying a house in the village of Abiquiu where she would live and work for the next 40 years. She was 59 years old, and she was just getting started on the most productive phase of her artistic career. But while Georgia was revolutionizing American art through her independent vision, another remarkable woman was transforming American education in ways that would benefit generations of young women. Our next story takes us to the hills of Massachusetts, where a teacher would choose to dedicate her life to creating educational opportunities for women in an era when most people believed that too much learning was dangerous for the female mind. Education has always been the most dangerous weapon against ignorance, and in 1830s America, one woman was about to prove just how explosive learning could be. While Georgia O'Keeffe was decades away from revolutionizing art, a 33-year-old teacher named Mary Lyon was facing a problem that would make her question everything she believed about women's potential. She had spent years teaching at various female seminaries, watching brilliant young women receive what could charitably be called an ornamental education. A little French, some needlework, maybe basic arithmetic, but nothing that would truly challenge their minds. The prevailing wisdom was that serious intellectual work would damage women's delicate constitutions and make them unfit for marriage and motherhood. Mary Lyon looked at this educational wasteland and decided to commit what many considered an act of revolutionary madness. She would create America's first college-level institution for women. Mary's rebellion began in the most unlikely place, a farmhouse in Buckland, Massachusetts, where she was born in 1797 to parents who valued hard work over higher learning. Her father died when she was 5, leaving her mother to raise 7 children on a struggling farm. Most girls in Mary's situation would have received minimal education before being sent to work as domestic servants or factory workers, but Mary had something that would change the course of American education. An absolutely unquenchable thirst for knowledge combined with the kind of stubborn determination that could move mountains. The turning point came when Mary was 13 and convinced her mother to let her attend the local academy during the winter months when farm work slowed down. She paid her tuition by doing housework for the academy's principal, essentially earning her education one cleaned floor and cooked meal at a time. But what she discovered in those classrooms changed everything. Mary realized that her mind was capable of understanding complex mathematics, classical literature, and scientific principles just as well as any male student. The problem wasn't that women couldn't learn, it was that no one was bothering to teach them properly. By her early 20s, Mary had become a teacher herself, but she was growing increasingly frustrated with the limitations of female education. The seminaries where she taught offered what historians now call ornamental accomplishments, just enough education to make women interesting companions for educated men, but not enough to make them independent thinkers. Students learned to paint watercolours, but not to understand chemistry. They studied enough mathematics to manage household accounts, but not enough to pursue scientific careers. They read literature but weren't encouraged to write original works themselves. Mary's revolutionary moment came in 1834 when she visited Amherst College and saw firsthand what real higher education looked like. She watched young men engage in rigorous scientific experiments, debate complex philosophical questions, and prepare for careers in medicine, law, and ministry. The contrast with female education was so stark it was almost absurd. Here were institutions spending thousands of dollars on laboratory equipment and extensive libraries for male students, while female seminaries were proud of their parlor pianos and flower gardens. The idea that would transform American education struck Mary like lightning. What if she created a women's institution that offered exactly the same rigorous curriculum as the best men's colleges? Not a seminary that prepared women to be ornamental wives, but a genuine college that prepared them to be teachers, writers, missionaries, and independent thinkers. It was an idea so radical that most people thought she had lost her mind. The practical challenges were staggering. In the 1830s, there were no wealthy philanthropists interested in funding women's higher education because most people believed it was unnecessary and potentially harmful. The medical establishment was actively arguing that too much mental exertion would damage women's reproductive systems. Religious leaders worried that educated women would become prideful and neglect their Christian duties. Even many women themselves were skeptical, having been taught that intellectual ambition was unfeminine and unattractive. But Mary had a secret weapon: her ability to frame revolutionary ideas in conservative language. Instead of arguing that women deserved education for its own sake, she argued that educated women would be better wives and mothers. Instead of challenging traditional gender roles directly, she emphasized that educated women could serve as teachers and missionaries, spreading Christian values and American civilization. She was essentially smuggling feminism inside a package that looked like traditional domesticity. Her fundraising strategy was brilliant and exhausting. Mary spent 3 years traveling throughout New England, speaking to women's groups, church organizations, and anyone who would listen. She would arrive in a town, stay with local families, and spend days convincing people to contribute small amounts, $5 here, $10 there, toward her vision of a women's college. She understood that she needed broad community support, not just wealthy donors, because she was essentially asking entire communities to change their beliefs about women's capabilities. The fundraising campaign reveals something remarkable about Mary's character. She was a single woman in her late 30s, travelling alone throughout rural New England, staying in strangers' homes, and arguing with men who believed women shouldn't even be speaking in public, let alone founding colleges. The physical and emotional demands were enormous, but Mary persevered because she understood that she was fighting for something larger than her own ambitions. She was fighting for the intellectual liberation of an entire gender. By 1836, Mary had raised enough money to purchase land in South Hadley, Massachusetts, and begin construction of what would become Mount Holyoke Seminary. But even the building process was revolutionary. Mary insisted that the seminary should look like a college, not a genteel finishing school. She wanted substantial laboratory space for scientific experiments, a real library with thousands of books, and dormitories where students could live together and form intellectual communities. The curriculum Mary designed was unprecedented in American women's education. Students at Mount Holyoke would study the same mathematics, sciences, and classical languages offered at Harvard and Yale. They would conduct original scientific research, write extensive papers, and engage in public speaking, skills that most female seminaries actively discouraged. Mary was essentially creating a parallel educational universe where women could develop their minds to their full potential. But perhaps most revolutionary was Mary's approach to domestic work. Instead of hiring servants to clean and maintain the seminary, Mary required all students to participate in domestic duties for 1 hour each day. This wasn't because she wanted to reinforce traditional gender roles. It was because she understood that many of her students couldn't afford education if they also had to pay for domestic services. By making domestic work part of the educational program, she made rigorous education accessible to middle-class and even some working-class families. The first class entered Mount Holyoke in 1837, and the results exceeded even Mary's ambitious expectations. These young women threw themselves into their studies with an intensity that shocked observers. They were staying up late to conduct chemistry experiments, forming literary societies to discuss complex philosophical questions, and writing letters home that revealed sophisticated understanding of current events and scientific discoveries. They were proving that women's minds were not only capable of serious intellectual work, but actually hungry for it. Mary's success attracted fierce opposition from those who believed she was disrupting the natural order of society. Critics argued that her graduates would become unsexed, too intellectual to be good wives and mothers. Medical authorities warned that intensive study would cause nervous breakdowns and reproductive problems. Religious conservatives worried that educated women would challenge male authority in churches and families, but the evidence was on Mary's side. Mount Holyoke graduates were becoming some of the most effective teachers, missionaries, and social reformers in America. They were founding schools throughout the country, traveling to foreign missions and proving that education enhanced rather than diminished their ability to contribute to society. Many did marry, and their letters show that their education made them more interesting companions and more effective mothers, not less. Mary's most brilliant innovation was her teacher training program. She understood that creating one excellent women's college wouldn't transform American education. She needed to create teachers who could spread her educational philosophy throughout the country. Mount Holyoke graduates went on to found dozens of schools and colleges, creating a network of institutions that offered serious education to thousands of American women. The personal cost of Mary's dedication was enormous. She never married, partly because she couldn't find a man who shared her educational vision, and partly because marriage would have meant giving up control of her institution. She lived simply, worked constantly, and worried continuously about funding and public opposition. She was essentially sacrificing her personal life to create educational opportunities for future generations of women. But Mary understood something profound about social change. It requires institutions, not just individual achievements. While other remarkable women were succeeding as isolated exceptions, the occasional female doctor or writer who overcame enormous obstacles, Mary was creating systematic change that would benefit thousands of women. She was proving that women's intellectual potential could be unleashed on a massive scale if society would just provide the proper educational opportunities. Mary died in 1849 at age 52, exhausted by her constant work but having lived to see Mount Holyoke firmly established as America's premier women's educational institution. By the time of her death, her graduates were teaching throughout America and around the world, spreading the revolutionary idea that women deserved the same quality education as men. But while Mary was revolutionizing women's education in Massachusetts, another brilliant woman was facing a different kind of educational challenge. Our next story takes us to the emerging field of genetics, where a scientist would discover that unlocking the secrets of heredity required not just intellectual brilliance, but the kind of patient, solitary dedication that marriage and family life would have made impossible. Deep in the cornfields of Cold Spring Harbor, New York, a quiet revolution was taking place that would unlock one of life's greatest mysteries. While Mary Lyon was transforming women's education in Massachusetts, the stage was being set for another kind of breakthrough, one that would require decades of patient observation, meticulous record-keeping, and the kind of obsessive dedication that very few people possess. Born in 1902, Barbara McClintock would grow up to discover something so fundamental about how life works that it would earn her a Nobel Prize. But first, she had to make a choice that would define her entire career. Would she follow the conventional path expected of women in the early 20th century, or would she dedicate herself completely to unraveling the secrets hidden inside the cells of corn plants? Barbara's journey into the microscopic world began at Cornell University in the 1920s, where she enrolled as one of only a handful of women studying plant breeding and genetics. This wasn't exactly a field that attracted many women, or frankly many people at all. Genetics was still a relatively new science, barely 20 years old as a formal discipline. Most people thought studying plant heredity was about as exciting as watching paint dry, but Barbara found something magical in the patterns of inheritance, the way traits passed from parent plants to their offspring in predictable yet mysterious ways. What made Barbara different from her classmates wasn't just her gender. It was her almost supernatural ability to see patterns that others missed. While other students looked at corn kernels and saw random variations in colour and shape, Barbara could detect subtle patterns that revealed the underlying genetic mechanisms at work. She had what her professors called a feeling for the organism, an intuitive understanding of how living things functioned that couldn't be taught from textbooks. But this gift came with a price. Barbara's intense focus on her scientific work made her seem strange to many of her contemporaries. While other young women in the 1920s were learning to dance the Charleston and navigate the new freedoms of the Jazz Age, Barbara was spending 16-hour days in the laboratory, hunched over a microscope, counting and categorizing corn kernels with obsessive precision. She was essentially choosing to live in a world that most people couldn't even see, the microscopic realm where the real secrets of life were hidden. The pressure to conform to traditional expectations was enormous. Barbara's professors, despite recognizing her brilliance, regularly suggested that she should consider more appropriate career paths. They would hint that a woman with her intelligence could make an excellent high school biology teacher or perhaps work as a laboratory assistant for a male scientist. The underlying message was always the same. Women could participate in science, but they shouldn't expect to lead it. Barbara's response to this pressure was characteristically direct. She ignored it completely. Instead of accepting a secondary role in science, she threw herself into research with an intensity that amazed even her mentors. She developed new techniques for staining and observing chromosomes under the microscope, allowing scientists to see genetic structures that had never been visible before. She was essentially creating the tools that would make modern genetics possible. But her most radical decision came in 1931 when she received her PhD and faced the question of what to do next. Most women in her position would have sought positions at women's colleges, or perhaps married fellow scientists and contributed to their husbands' research. Barbara chose a third path. She would become an independent researcher, pursuing her own questions regardless of whether institutions were ready to support a woman scientist. This choice required enormous personal sacrifice. Barbara spent the 1930s moving from one temporary research position to another, never sure where her next paycheck would come from. She lived in rented rooms, owned almost no personal possessions, and had no job security whatsoever. But this precarious lifestyle also gave her something precious: complete intellectual freedom. She could pursue whatever questions fascinated her, without worrying about department politics or traditional research priorities. During these nomadic years, Barbara began to focus on a problem that would consume the next 4 decades of her life: understanding how genes were organized and regulated within chromosomes. Using corn as her experimental system, she started conducting breeding experiments that required incredible patience and precision. Each experiment took an entire growing season to complete, and meaningful results required tracking genetic patterns across multiple generations. The work was monumentally tedious. Barbara would plant thousands of corn kernels, carefully cross-pollinate specific plants, harvest the resulting seeds, and then examine each kernel under a microscope to track how genetic traits were inherited. She developed her own shorthand notation system to record the complex patterns she observed, filling notebook after notebook with observations that only she could fully interpret. But in 1944, Barbara began to notice something that didn't make sense according to the established laws of genetics. She was observing corn kernels with colour patterns that changed during the plant's development, patches of pigmented and unpigmented cells that suggested genes were somehow moving around within chromosomes. This was supposed to be impossible. The scientific consensus was that genes were fixed in place on chromosomes, like beads permanently strung on a wire. Barbara's initial reaction was typical of great scientists. She assumed she had made an error and spent months double-checking her observations. But the patterns persisted, and gradually Barbara began to realize that she had discovered something revolutionary. Genes weren't fixed in place. They could actually jump from one location to another within the genome. She was observing what would later be called transposable elements, or jumping genes. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If genes could move around, it meant that the genome was far more dynamic and complex than anyone had imagined. It suggested that organisms had sophisticated mechanisms for regulating gene expression that could respond to environmental pressures. Barbara was essentially discovering that the genome was not a static blueprint, but a dynamic, responsive system capable of adapting and evolving in real time. But when Barbara tried to share her findings with the scientific community, she encountered something that was both heartbreaking and infuriating: complete disbelief. At conferences and seminars throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, Barbara would present her carefully documented evidence for jumping genes, only to watch audiences respond with skepticism that bordered on dismissal. The prevailing theories of genetics couldn't accommodate her findings, so most scientists simply assumed she was wrong. The rejection was particularly painful because Barbara knew her observations were correct. She had spent years documenting these patterns with meticulous care, developing multiple lines of evidence to support her conclusions. But the scientific establishment wasn't ready to accept that their fundamental understanding of genetics might be incomplete. Barbara found herself in the lonely position of being decades ahead of her time. Her response to this rejection reveals something profound about her character. Instead of campaigning aggressively for acceptance or modifying her findings to fit prevailing theories, Barbara essentially withdrew from the scientific mainstream. She continued her research at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, but she stopped trying to convince skeptics. She understood that she was working on problems that were too complex for the current state of genetic knowledge to fully appreciate. For nearly 2 decades, Barbara worked in relative isolation, continuing to study transposable elements while the rest of the genetics community pursued other questions. She published her findings in specialized journals that few people read, gave occasional lectures to small audiences, and maintained her research with minimal institutional support. She was essentially betting her entire career on the conviction that time would vindicate her discoveries. The vindication came gradually, starting in the 1960s when molecular biology techniques became sophisticated enough to detect the mechanisms Barbara had been describing. As scientists developed methods for analyzing DNA directly, they began to find exactly the kinds of mobile genetic elements that Barbara had predicted. By the 1970s, jumping genes were being discovered in bacteria, fruit flies, and eventually humans. The scientific community's recognition of Barbara's genius culminated in 1983 when she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine at age 81 after more than 30 years of working in relative obscurity. In her Nobel lecture, Barbara reflected on the lonely years when no one believed her findings. "I was not invited to give lectures or seminars except on rare occasions, and then I presented only uninterpretable observations. It never occurred to me to stop because I was having such a good time." Barbara's story reveals something important about the relationship between independence and scientific discovery. Her decision to remain single wasn't motivated by misanthropy or fear of intimacy. It was a strategic choice that allowed her to pursue questions that required decades of patient, solitary work. The kind of research Barbara conducted simply couldn't have been done by someone with the demands and distractions of family life. But Barbara's independence went beyond marital status. She had essentially created her own scientific universe, complete with its own methods, notation systems, and theoretical frameworks. She had learned to trust her own observations over scientific consensus, to value patience over publicity, and to find joy in discovery regardless of external recognition. Perhaps most remarkably, Barbara maintained her sense of wonder and curiosity throughout her long career. Even in her 80s, she continued to work in her laboratory, pursuing new questions about plant genetics with the same enthusiasm that had driven her as a young graduate student. She had proven that a life dedicated to understanding nature's secrets could be profoundly fulfilling, even when that dedication required enormous personal sacrifice. While Barbara was revolutionizing genetics through her patient, solitary observations, another remarkable woman was preparing to conquer a very different frontier. Our next story takes us to the dawn of aviation, where a young woman would choose to risk everything, including her life, to prove that the sky belonged to women as much as men. The roar of engines and the promise of infinite sky called to her like nothing else ever had. While Barbara McClintock was peering into microscopes to unlock genetic secrets, a young woman in Kansas was looking up instead of down, captivated by the flying machines that were transforming the early 20th century. Amelia Mary Earhart was born in 1897 into a world where women were expected to keep their feet firmly planted on the ground. But she had always been drawn to heights, climbing trees as a child, building roller coasters in her backyard, and dreaming of adventures that most girls of her era couldn't even imagine. What no one expected was that this tomboyish girl from Atchison, Kansas, would grow up to become the most famous female pilot in history, and that her greatest act of rebellion wouldn't be learning to fly. It would be refusing to let marriage clip her wings. Amelia's path to aviation was anything but straightforward. Growing up in a family where her father struggled with alcoholism and financial instability, she learned early that security was an illusion and that the only person she could truly depend on was herself. By her early 20s, she had bounced between colleges, worked as a nurse's aide during World War I, and was struggling to figure out what to do with her life. Then, in December 1920, everything changed. At a California airfield, Amelia took her first airplane ride, a 10-minute flight that cost her father $10 and changed the trajectory of her entire existence. She later described that first flight in terms that sound almost mystical. As soon as we left the ground, I knew I myself had to fly. This wasn't just excitement about a new hobby. It was the recognition of a calling that would shape every major decision for the rest of her life. Within 6 months, Amelia had scraped together enough money for flying lessons, working at jobs ranging from truck driver to photographer, to pay for her training. She was essentially willing to do anything to earn the money needed to learn this dangerous, expensive, and completely impractical skill. But here's what makes Amelia's story remarkable. She wasn't content to be just another recreational pilot. From the beginning, she understood that aviation offered women a unique opportunity to prove their capabilities in a field where physical strength mattered less than skill, courage, and quick thinking. In the cockpit, what mattered wasn't whether you could lift heavy objects or conform to social expectations. What mattered was whether you could read instruments, make split-second decisions, and keep your nerve when things went wrong. Amelia's first major breakthrough came in 1928 when she was selected to become the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. There was just one catch. She wouldn't actually be piloting the plane. The flight's organizers wanted a woman aboard for publicity purposes, but they weren't willing to trust something as important as navigation to a female pilot. Amelia would be essentially a passenger with a pilot's license, while 2 male aviators handled the actual flying. Most women would have been thrilled by the opportunity to participate in such a historic flight, even as a passenger. But Amelia was frustrated by the limitations placed on her role. She spent the entire 20-hour flight feeling like what she called a sack of potatoes, present for publicity but not permitted to demonstrate her actual flying skills. When they landed in Wales and she was hailed as a hero, Amelia felt like a fraud. She had crossed the Atlantic, but she hadn't really flown across it. That experience crystallized something important for Amelia. She understood that being the first woman to wasn't enough if it didn't represent genuine achievement and capability. She was determined to prove that women could not only participate in aviation, but excel at it. This drive would motivate her to spend the next 4 years preparing for something that had never been accomplished: a solo transatlantic flight by a woman. The technical and psychological challenges of solo transatlantic flying in 1932 were almost unimaginable. This was an era when aviation technology was still primitive and unreliable. Planes had no sophisticated navigation equipment, no radio communication systems, and no weather radar. Pilots navigated by compass and landmarks, often flying blind through clouds and storms. Engine failures were common, and a pilot flying solo over the Atlantic had no backup if something went wrong. But Amelia understood something that her critics didn't. These technical challenges were exactly why women needed to prove themselves in aviation. If flying were easy and safe, there would be no particular achievement in demonstrating that women could do it. The danger and difficulty were precisely what made success meaningful. She was essentially arguing that women deserved the right to take the same risks and attempt the same achievements as men. On May 20th, 1932, exactly 5 years after Charles Lindbergh's famous solo flight, Amelia took off from Newfoundland in her bright red Lockheed Vega, heading for Paris. What happened during that flight reveals everything about her character as both a pilot and a person. About 4 hours into the flight, her altimeter failed, making it impossible to know her exact altitude. Ice began forming on her wings, forcing her to fly dangerously low over the ocean. Fuel started leaking into the cockpit, creating a fire hazard. Most pilots would have turned back or looked for the nearest place to land. Amelia kept flying. When mechanical problems made it clear she couldn't reach Paris, she adjusted her destination to Ireland. When fuel ran low, she landed in a farmer's field in Londonderry, becoming the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, and only the second person ever to make the crossing alone. The flight that was supposed to take about 15 hours had taken 14 hours and 56 minutes, and she had covered nearly 2,000 miles of open ocean with primitive instruments and a partially functioning aircraft. The global response to Amelia's achievement was extraordinary. She became an instant international celebrity, receiving honours from governments around the world and inspiring countless young women to pursue careers in aviation. But what's most interesting about Amelia's reaction to this fame is how she used it strategically to advance women's opportunities in aviation and other fields. Amelia understood that her celebrity gave her a platform to advocate for women's equality in ways that would have been impossible for a private citizen. She began writing articles and giving lectures arguing that women deserved equal opportunities in all professions, not just aviation. She became a faculty member at Purdue University, where she counseled young women about career opportunities and encouraged them to pursue unconventional paths. But perhaps most significantly, Amelia made a decision about marriage that shocked her contemporaries and provides crucial insight into her priorities. In 1931, she married George Palmer Putnam, a successful publisher and publicist who had been instrumental in managing her career. But the terms of their marriage were revolutionary for the 1930s. Amelia insisted on keeping her own name, maintaining her own bank accounts, and continuing her aviation career without interference from her husband. Most remarkably, Amelia wrote George a letter before their wedding that essentially laid out the conditions under which she would agree to marry. She wrote, "I want you to understand, I shall not hold you to any medieval code of faithfulness to me, nor shall I consider myself bound to you similarly. Please let us not interfere with the other's work or play, nor let the world see our private joys or disagreements. In this connection, I may have to keep some place where I can go to be myself now and then, for I cannot guarantee to endure at all times the confinements of even an attractive cage." This letter reveals something profound about Amelia's understanding of what marriage could and couldn't be. She wasn't rejecting marriage entirely, but she was rejecting the traditional model that required women to subordinate their ambitions to their husbands' careers. She was essentially negotiating a marriage contract that would preserve her independence and freedom to pursue dangerous, time-consuming aviation adventures. The arrangement worked because George understood that Amelia's aviation achievements were not just personal accomplishments, but historical events that would benefit from professional management and publicity. He wasn't threatened by his wife's fame and independence. He was proud of it and actively worked to support her goals. Their marriage became a model of how two ambitious people could support each other's careers without traditional gender role constraints. But Amelia's most ambitious project was yet to come. By the mid-1930s, she had set her sights on a goal that would push both aviation technology and human endurance to their limits, flying around the world at the equator, covering approximately 29,000 miles in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra. This wasn't just about being the first woman to accomplish such a flight. It was about advancing aviation science and proving that long-distance air travel could become a practical reality. The technical preparations for this flight were enormous. Amelia worked with engineers to modify her aircraft with additional fuel tanks, navigation equipment, and communication systems. She studied weather patterns, international regulations, and emergency procedures for dozens of countries. She was essentially planning a flight that would serve as a proof of concept for future commercial aviation routes. But on July 2, 1937, during the most challenging portion of her around-the-world flight, Amelia and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. They had taken off from New Guinea, heading for tiny Howland Island, a landing strip barely visible from the air, located in the middle of the vast Pacific. Radio contact was lost, and despite the most extensive search and rescue operation in aviation history at that time, no trace of Amelia or her aircraft was ever found. Amelia's disappearance created one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries, but her legacy was already secure. She had proven that women could excel in the most demanding and dangerous aspects of aviation. She'd used her fame to advocate for women's equality in ways that advanced opportunities for future generations. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that marriage and independence weren't mutually exclusive. They just required partners willing to support each other's dreams rather than limit them. While Amelia was pushing the boundaries of what was possible in the sky, another brilliant woman was revolutionizing our understanding of how economies function here on Earth. Our next story takes us to Cambridge University, where an economist would challenge the fundamental assumptions of her field and prove that women could contribute groundbreaking insights to the supposedly masculine world of economic theory. Numbers don't lie, but they don't always tell the whole truth either. While Amelia Earhart was challenging the limits of what was possible in the physical world, a brilliant mind at Cambridge University was about to revolutionize how we understand the invisible forces that govern modern life: economics. Joan Violet Robinson was born in 1903 into an era when most people believed that economic theory was far too complex and important for women to comprehend, let alone contribute to. After all, this was the domain of policymakers, bank presidents, and government officials, serious men making serious decisions about serious money. But Joan looked at the economic theories dominating her field and saw something that would make her one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. They were fundamentally wrong about how competition actually works in the real world. Joan's journey into economics began at Cambridge University in the 1920s, where she was one of only a handful of women studying what was then considered an exclusively masculine discipline. Economics in this era was dominated by elegant mathematical models that assumed perfect competition, a theoretical world where countless small businesses competed on equal terms, where consumers had perfect information, and where markets naturally reached equilibrium. These models were beautiful, logical, and completely divorced from the messy reality of how businesses actually operated. What fascinated Joan wasn't the mathematical elegance of these theories, but their glaring inability to explain what she observed in the real world. She could see that most industries were dominated by a few large companies, that businesses spent enormous amounts on advertising to influence consumer preferences, and that prices often seem to have little relationship to production costs. The gap between economic theory and economic reality was so vast that Joan began to wonder if economists were studying an imaginary system rather than the actual economy. The turning point came in the early 1930s when Joan began developing what would become her masterpiece, The Economics of Imperfect Competition. This wasn't just another academic treatise. It was a systematic demolition of the theoretical foundations that had dominated economic thinking for over a century. Joan was essentially arguing that the entire profession had been studying a fantasy version of capitalism that bore little resemblance to how businesses actually competed. But here's what makes Joan's story so compelling. She wasn't working in isolation. She was part of what became known as the Cambridge School, a group of brilliant economists including John Maynard Keynes, who were revolutionizing economic thinking. But while her male colleagues were often content to develop theories that would impress other academics, Joan was driven by a more practical concern. She wanted to understand how economic systems actually affected real people's lives. Joan's analysis of imperfect competition revealed something that sounds obvious now but was revolutionary in the 1930s. Most businesses don't compete by lowering prices until they barely make a profit. Instead, they compete by creating unique products, building brand loyalty, and trying to establish monopolistic advantages that allow them to charge higher prices. She was describing what we now recognize as the normal state of modern capitalism, an economy dominated by brands, advertising, and companies trying to differentiate themselves from their competitors. The implications of Joan's work were staggering. If businesses weren't locked in perfect competition, then many of the fundamental assumptions of economic policy needed to be reconsidered. If companies could influence consumer preferences through advertising, then the idea that markets automatically reflected consumer needs became questionable. If large corporations could use their size to squeeze out smaller competitors, then the assumption that free markets naturally promoted efficiency was flawed. But Joan's revolutionary insights came with a personal cost that reveals something important about the choices facing brilliant women in the early 20th century. In 1926, she had married Joan Robinson, a fellow economist who was supportive of her work but whose own career was following a more traditional academic path. Joan faced a dilemma that male economists never had to consider: how to balance groundbreaking intellectual work with the expectations and demands of marriage. Joan's solution was characteristically pragmatic and revolutionary. Instead of choosing between her marriage and her career, she negotiated a relationship that allowed her to maintain complete intellectual independence while fulfilling her domestic responsibilities. She and Austen developed what was essentially a professional partnership disguised as a traditional marriage. They collaborated on research projects, discussed economic theories over breakfast, and supported each other's academic advancement. This arrangement required Joan to be extraordinarily efficient with her time and energy. She would write in the early morning hours before household responsibilities began, conduct research during the day while managing domestic duties, and attend academic conferences and seminars as her schedule permitted. She was essentially working two full-time jobs, economist and housewife, but she was doing both with a level of excellence that amazed her contemporaries. Joan's 1933 book, The Economics of Imperfect Competition, established her as one of the world's leading economic theorists, but it also revealed something important about her intellectual approach. While many economists were content to develop abstract models that explained theoretical possibilities, Joan was focused on describing actual economic behavior. She wasn't interested in how markets should work according to mathematical models. She wanted to understand how they actually did work in practice. The book's impact was immediate and profound. Economists around the world began to recognize that Joan had identified fundamental flaws in the theoretical foundations of their discipline. Business schools started teaching her concepts to students who would go on to become corporate executives and policymakers. Government officials began to understand why antitrust laws might be necessary to prevent large corporations from stifling competition, but perhaps most importantly, Joan had proven that women could contribute original, groundbreaking insights to fields that had been considered exclusively masculine domains. She wasn't just applying existing economic theories, she was creating new theoretical frameworks that better explained how modern economies actually functioned. Joan's success in economics opened doors for her to tackle even larger questions about capitalism, socialism, and economic development. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, she became increasingly interested in how economic systems could be reformed to serve human needs rather than just maximizing profits. She began writing about economic planning, international development, and the relationship between economic growth and social welfare. This evolution in Joan's thinking reveals something important about her character. She wasn't content to be a successful academic who published impressive papers and attended prestigious conferences. She wanted her economic insights to contribute to creating a more just and equitable society. She was using her intellectual gifts not just to understand how the economy worked, but to envision how it could work better. Joan's later work on economic development was particularly influential in helping newly independent countries in Africa and Asia design economic policies. She spent considerable time traveling to China, India, and other developing nations, studying their economic challenges and offering advice on development strategies. She was proving that economic theory could be a tool for social progress, not just academic advancement. But what's most remarkable about Joan's career is how she maintained her intellectual independence throughout decades of changing academic fashions and political pressures. When Keynesian economics was dominant, she supported it, but also pointed out its limitations. When monetarism became popular, she criticized its assumptions about how money and markets worked. She was never interested in being part of any particular economic school. She was interested in understanding economic reality, regardless of whether that understanding supported popular theories. Joan's approach to marriage and career created a model that was decades ahead of its time. She and Austen maintained separate but complementary academic careers, collaborated when their interests overlapped, and supported each other's individual achievements. They proved that marriage between intellectuals could enhance rather than limit both partners' professional development. By the 1960s, Joan had become one of the most respected economists in the world, regularly consulted by governments and international organizations on major economic policy questions. She had proven that women could not only contribute to economic theory, but could revolutionize it. She had shown that intellectual brilliance combined with practical concern for human welfare could generate insights that purely theoretical approaches missed. Joan's legacy in economics continues to influence how we understand modern capitalism. Her insights about imperfect competition, brand differentiation, and corporate behavior are now considered fundamental concepts that every economics student learns. She helped create the theoretical foundations for understanding how advertising works, why antitrust laws are necessary, and how large corporations can manipulate markets. Perhaps most importantly, Joan demonstrated that refusing to accept conventional wisdom, whether about economics or about women's capabilities, could lead to revolutionary discoveries. She proved that questioning fundamental assumptions, even when those assumptions were supported by prestigious institutions and brilliant minds, could reveal truths that had been hidden in plain sight. While Joan was revolutionizing economic theory through rigorous analysis and practical observation, another intellectual revolutionary was preparing to challenge even more fundamental assumptions about human nature, society, and the relationship between men and women. Our next story takes us to post-war Paris, where a philosopher would write a book that would transform how women understood themselves and their place in the world. Sometimes a single sentence can shatter everything we thought we knew about ourselves. While Joan Robinson was dismantling economic theories at Cambridge, In the smoky cafes of post-war Paris, another brilliant woman was preparing to write words that would ignite a revolution in how humanity understood gender, identity, and freedom itself. Simone de Beauvoir was born in 1908 into a bourgeois French family that expected her to follow the traditional path of marriage, motherhood, and domestic contentment. Instead, she would write a book that began with one of the most explosive statements in modern philosophy. One is not born, but rather becomes, a woman. With those 8 words, Simone would challenge not just social conventions, but the very idea that biology determines destiny. Her refusal to marry wasn't just personal preference, it was a philosophical statement about what it means to be human. Simone's intellectual awakening began at the Sorbonne in the 1920s, where she was studying philosophy alongside some of the brightest minds of her generation. Philosophy in this era was almost exclusively a male domain, a world of abstract reasoning, logical argumentation, and systematic thinking that most people believed was beyond women's intellectual capabilities. But Simone discovered something that would shape her entire approach to philosophy. The abstract theories she was studying in the classroom often had very concrete effects on how people actually lived their lives. The moment that changed everything came in 1929 when Simone met Jean-Paul Sartre, a fellow philosophy student who had become not just her intellectual partner, but her collaborator in creating a completely new way of thinking about human existence. Their first conversation lasted through the night, covering everything from the nature of consciousness to the meaning of freedom. Sartre later said that Simone was the only person who could challenge his ideas and make him think more clearly. For Simone, meeting Sartre was like finding her intellectual twin, someone who shared her passion for rigorous thinking and her belief that philosophy should change how people lived. But here's where Simone's story becomes revolutionary. When Sartre proposed marriage in 1931, she said no. This wasn't a rejection of Sartre himself. She was deeply in love with him and would remain his partner for the rest of their lives. It was a rejection of the institution of marriage and everything it represented. Simone understood that marriage in 1930s France would legally transform her from an independent intellectual into someone whose identity was defined by her relationship to her husband. Instead, Simone and Sartre created what they called a necessary love, a partnership based on complete intellectual and emotional honesty, but without the legal and social constraints of marriage. They agreed to tell each other everything, to support each other's work unconditionally, and to maintain their individual freedom to pursue other relationships and interests. It was essentially a contract for intellectual partnership that prioritized authenticity over social respectability. This arrangement scandalized French society but gave Simone something precious: the freedom to develop her philosophical ideas without the domestic responsibilities and social expectations that marriage would have imposed. While married women of her generation were managing households and raising children, Simone was writing novels, philosophical treatises, and essays that would influence how people thought about existence, freedom, and identity. But Simone's most revolutionary contribution began during World War II, when she started thinking systematically about why women throughout history had been treated as inferior to men. She began to realize that what people called feminine nature wasn't actually natural at all. It was the result of centuries of social conditioning, legal restrictions, and cultural expectations that had convinced both men and women that gender differences were biologically determined rather than socially constructed. The research for what would become the second sex took Simone years to complete. She read everything she could find about women's status throughout history: biological studies, anthropological research, psychological theories, literary works, and philosophical treatises. What she discovered was both fascinating and infuriating. Every field of knowledge had developed elaborate theories to explain why women were naturally inferior to men, But these theories contradicted each other and often had no empirical support whatsoever. Simone realized that the problem wasn't that women were naturally different from men. It was that society had created artificial differences and then used those differences to justify treating women as second-class citizens. She was essentially discovering that gender was a performance rather than a biological destiny, that femininity was a social role rather than a natural characteristic. The writing of The Second Sex revealed something important about Simone's approach to intellectual work. She wasn't content to develop abstract theories that would impress other philosophers. She wanted to understand how ideas about gender affected real women's lives. She interviewed women from all social classes, studied how different cultures defined femininity, and analysed how legal systems and social institutions reinforced gender inequality. When The Second Sex was published in 1949, the reaction was explosive. The Catholic Church placed it on their index of forbidden books. Conservative critics accused Simone of promoting immorality and threatening the foundations of civilization. Even progressive intellectuals were often uncomfortable with her systematic demolition of assumptions about gender that they had never questioned. But women around the world read Simone's book and felt something that many had never experienced before: intellectual validation for feelings they had never been able to articulate. Simone was giving women a vocabulary to understand their own experiences of restriction, frustration, and unfulfilled potential. She was proving that what many women had sensed individually, that their limitations weren't natural but imposed, was actually supported by rigorous philosophical analysis. The core insight of The Second Sex was revolutionary in its simplicity. Throughout history, women had been defined as the other, not as independent human beings, but as deviations from the male norm. Men were considered the universal human type, while women were seen as a specialized, limited version of humanity. This wasn't just unfair, it was philosophically incoherent, because it treated half of humanity as less than fully human. Simone's analysis went beyond gender roles to examine how this othering process worked in all areas of society. She showed how women were excluded from creating culture, defining values, and shaping institutions, then blamed for the very limitations that this exclusion created. She was essentially revealing how oppression operated as a self-reinforcing system that convinced both oppressors and oppressed that inequality was natural and inevitable. But perhaps most importantly, Simone argued that women's liberation wasn't just about improving women's lives. It was about creating more authentic human relationships and a more just society for everyone. She understood that rigid gender roles limited men as well as women, forcing people into narrow definitions of what it meant to be human. Simone's personal life embodied her philosophical principles in ways that continued to shock conservative society. She and Sartre maintained their unconventional partnership for over 50 years, supporting each other's work while pursuing independent projects and relationships. She travelled extensively, wrote prolifically, and engaged in political activism that took her to Cuba, China, Algeria, and other places where social revolutions were challenging established power structures. The relationship between Simone and Sartre also revealed something important about how intellectual partnerships could work when both people were committed to each other's freedom and authenticity. They read and critiqued each other's work, collaborated on political projects, and maintained an emotional intimacy that was based on complete honesty rather than conventional romantic ideals. Simone's refusal to marry wasn't just about rejecting social conventions. It was about creating space for a different kind of relationship that prioritized intellectual and emotional growth over security and respectability. She was proving that love could be deeper and more meaningful when it was chosen freely, rather than imposed by social expectations. By the 1960s and 1970s, the The second sex had become one of the foundational texts of the modern feminist movement. Women's liberation activists around the world were using Simone's insights to understand their own experiences and develop strategies for social change. She'd provided both the intellectual framework and the moral authority for a movement that would transform how societies thought about gender, equality, and human potential. But Simone's influence extended beyond feminism to existentialism, ethics, and political philosophy. She had proven that personal choices about how to live could have profound philosophical implications, and that philosophical insights could transform how people understood their own possibilities for freedom and authenticity. Perhaps most remarkably, Simone maintained her intellectual productivity and political engagement well into her 70s, continuing to write, speak, and advocate for social justice until her death in 1986. She had proven that a life dedicated to intellectual freedom and authentic relationships could be both personally fulfilling and historically significant. While Simone was revolutionizing how we understand gender and identity through philosophical analysis, another remarkable woman was making discoveries that would fundamentally change how we understand the origins of human thought itself. Our next story takes us to 19th century London, where a mathematician would write what many consider the first computer program, decades before computers were even imagined. Imagine being able to see the future so clearly that you could write instructions for machines that wouldn't be invented for another century. While Simone de Beauvoir was deconstructing the myths about women's intellectual capabilities in 20th century Paris, let's journey back to Victorian London, where a young woman was about to prove that genius has no gender in the most spectacular way possible. Ada King, Countess of Lovelace, was born Augusta Ada Byron in 1815, the daughter of the scandalous poet Lord Byron, who abandoned his family when Ada was just 1 month old. What no one could have predicted was that this little girl, raised by a mother determined to prevent her from inheriting her father's dangerous poetic temperament, would grow up to envision the digital age over 100 years before the first computer was built. Ada didn't just refuse marriage in the traditional sense. She refused to be limited by any of the expectations placed on 19th century women, creating a life that was part mathematician, part visionary, and entirely revolutionary. Ada's story begins with one of history's most fascinating educational experiments. Her mother, Lady Anne Byron, was terrified that Ada might inherit Lord Byron's wild imagination and moral instability. So she decided to immunize her daughter against poetry and romantic fancy by immersing her in mathematics and science, subjects that Victorian society considered both appropriate for young ladies and safely rational. It was like trying to prevent someone from becoming a musician by forcing them to study only sheet music theory. But the result was unexpected. Ada fell in love with the logical beauty of mathematics. By age 12, Ada was designing flying machines, studying bird anatomy to understand the principles of flight, and creating detailed engineering drawings that wouldn't have looked out of place in a modern aerospace laboratory. She wasn't just playing with mathematical concepts, she was using them to solve practical problems and envision technological possibilities that wouldn't become reality for generations. But what made Ada truly extraordinary wasn't just her mathematical ability, it was her unique combination of logical precision and imaginative vision. While most mathematicians of her era focused on solving existing problems, Ada was imagining problems that didn't exist yet. She could see patterns and possibilities that escaped even the most brilliant minds of her time. The encounter that would change the course of computing history happened in 1833 when 17-year-old Ada met Charles Babbage, a Cambridge professor who had designed something called the difference engine, a mechanical calculator that could perform complex mathematical computations automatically. Most people saw Babbage's machine as an impressive but limited tool for solving mathematical problems. Ada saw something completely different. She saw the future. What fascinated Ada about Babbage's work wasn't just the difference engine, but his plans for something even more ambitious, the analytical engine, a theoretical machine that could be programmed to perform any mathematical operation. While Babbage was focused on the engineering challenges of building such a device, Ada was thinking about what it could actually do once it was built. This is where Ada's story becomes almost mystical in its prescience. In 1843, she wrote what historians now recognize as the first computer program, a set of instructions for calculating Bernoulli numbers using Babbage's theoretical analytical engine. But more importantly, she wrote something that wouldn't be fully appreciated until the digital age, a vision of what programmable machines could accomplish. In her famous Note G, Ada wrote, "The analytical engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent." Think about what Ada was describing in 1843. She was envisioning machines that could compose music, create art, and manipulate symbols rather than just numbers. She was essentially describing artificial intelligence, multimedia computing, and digital creativity over a century before anyone had even imagined electronic computers. But Ada's vision went even further. She understood that the real power of programmable machines wouldn't come from their ability to calculate faster than humans, but from their ability to follow complex logical instructions and manipulate abstract symbols. She was seeing past the mechanical gears and wheels of Babbage's designs to envision something that wouldn't become reality until the electronic age. What makes Ada's insights even more remarkable is that she developed them while navigating the complex social expectations of being an aristocratic Victorian woman. In 1835, she married William King, who later became the Earl of Lovelace, making Ada a countess. But unlike most aristocratic wives of her era, Ada negotiated a marriage that allowed her to continue her mathematical work and maintain her intellectual independence. Ada's approach to marriage was revolutionary for its time. She insisted on having her own study where she could work on mathematical problems without interruption. She corresponded with leading scientists and mathematicians of her day, including Mary Somerville, one of the few other women engaged in serious mathematical research. She maintained her identity as a mathematician and inventor, not just as a wife and mother. But Ada's unconventional life came with costs that reveal the constraints facing even the most privileged women of her era. Her mathematical work was often dismissed by male scientists who couldn't believe that a woman could understand complex theoretical concepts. Her collaboration with Babbage was frequently described as if she were merely his assistant, rather than an equal partner with original insights. The gambling addiction that would eventually destroy Ada's finances also reveals something important about the pressures facing brilliant women in an era that offered them few legitimate outlets for their talents. Ada became obsessed with developing mathematical systems for predicting horse race outcomes, essentially trying to apply her analytical skills to creating wealth through gambling. It was a tragically misguided attempt to achieve financial independence through the one area where her mathematical talents were socially acceptable, games of chance. Ada's gambling debts became so enormous that she had to pawn her family jewels and ask friends for loans. Her husband, initially supportive of her intellectual pursuits, became increasingly concerned about her erratic behavior and financial irresponsibility. The same brilliant mind that could envision the digital age was trapped in a society that offered no legitimate ways for women to earn money through intellectual work. But perhaps most tragically, Ada died of uterine cancer in 1852 at just 36 years old, before she could fully develop her ideas about machine intelligence and programmable computers. We can only imagine what she might have accomplished with modern resources and a society that valued women's intellectual contributions. Ada's mathematical notebooks, discovered decades after her death, reveal the depth and sophistication of her thinking about computation, logic, and machine intelligence. She'd been working on problems related to mathematical modelling, algorithmic thinking, and symbolic manipulation that wouldn't be seriously studied again until the 20th century. What's most remarkable about Ada's legacy is how accurately she predicted the development of computing technology. Her vision of machines that could manipulate symbols, follow complex logical instructions, and even create art and music describes exactly what modern computers do every day. She understood that the real revolution wouldn't come from machines that calculated faster, but from machines that could think symbolically. Ada's approach to the relationship between mathematics and imagination also proved prophetic. While most mathematicians of her era saw their field as purely logical and rational, Ada understood that mathematical thinking required creative leaps and intuitive insights. She was essentially describing what we now recognize as the creative aspects of programming, algorithm design, and computational thinking. Modern computer scientists studying Ada's work are amazed by how many fundamental concepts of programming and computer science she anticipated. The idea of subroutines, the concept of debugging, the distinction between hardware and software, and the vision of machines as general-purpose symbol manipulators rather than just calculators. Ada's life proves something important about the relationship between individual genius and social opportunity. She accomplished extraordinary things despite the limitations placed on women in her era, but we can only wonder what she might have achieved in a society that fully supported women's intellectual development and provided them with adequate resources and recognition. But while Ada was envisioning the digital future from her Victorian drawing room, another remarkable woman was dedicating her life to improving the immediate present for society's most vulnerable members. Our next story takes us to industrial Chicago, where a social reformer would reject the comfortable life of a privileged spinster to create innovative solutions for urban poverty and social injustice. Compassion without action is just sentiment, but action guided by compassion can transform the world. While Ada Lovelace was envisioning the digital future from her privileged Victorian parlour, across the Atlantic in industrial America, another remarkable woman was facing a choice that would define not just her own life, but the lives of thousands of society's most forgotten people. Jane Addams was born in 1860 into a prosperous Illinois family that could have provided her with a lifetime of comfortable domesticity. Her father was a successful businessman and state senator. Her stepmother was socially prominent, and Jane herself was intelligent, well-educated, and entirely equipped to become the perfect Victorian lady. But in 1889, at age 29, Jane made a decision that shocked polite society. She moved into one of Chicago's most dangerous slums and dedicated her life to something that most people considered either impossible or inadvisable, proving that the poor deserved dignity, opportunity, and hope. Jane's awakening to social injustice didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of feeling increasingly suffocated by the comfortable meaninglessness of upper-class women's lives. After graduating from Rockford Female Seminary in 1881, she found herself in the frustrating position of being highly educated but having nowhere to apply her intelligence. Victorian society offered women of her class 3 options: marriage, invalidism, or what was charitably called useful spinsterhood. essentially becoming a decorative appendage to her family's social activities. Jane tried the conventional path for several years, but it nearly destroyed her. She spent 8 years after graduation drifting through what she later called the snare of preparation, studying languages, travelling in Europe, and generally filling time with the activities that were considered appropriate for unmarried ladies of leisure. The emptiness of this existence triggered what we would now recognise as severe depression, complete with mysterious physical ailments that her doctors couldn't diagnose or cure. The turning point came during a trip to London in 1888 when Jane visited Toynbee Hall, a settlement house where university-educated men lived among the poor in East London slums. She watched these young graduates teaching classes, providing medical care, and offering legal advice to people who had been written off by society. For the first time in years, Jane felt something that had been missing from her comfortable life, a sense of purpose that was larger than her own personal satisfaction. But what Jane observed at Toynbee Hall also revealed something troubling. This groundbreaking social work was being conducted entirely by men, as if helping the poor required masculine strength and authority that women supposedly lacked. Jane looked at this assumption and recognized it as exactly the kind of arbitrary limitation that had been frustrating her for years. If men could live among the poor and work for social justice, why couldn't women do the same thing, and possibly do it better? The idea that would transform American social work crystallized during Jane's voyage back to America. She would create a settlement house run by and for women, based on the revolutionary principle that educated women had not just the right, but the responsibility to apply their intelligence to solving society's problems. She wasn't just planning to help the poor, she was planning to demonstrate that women could be leaders in addressing the social challenges that traditional politics had failed to solve. Finding the right location required Jane to do something that shocked her social circle. She spent months walking through Chicago's worst neighborhoods, investigating living conditions that most people of her class preferred to ignore. She was looking for a place where educated women could live safely among the poor, while still being accessible to the immigrant families who needed their help most desperately. Hull House, the mansion Jane purchased in 1889, was located in one of Chicago's most densely populated and impoverished neighborhoods. The area was home to recent immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, who were struggling to survive in an industrial economy that offered them dangerous jobs, inadequate housing, and almost no social services. Crime rates were high, sanitation was non-existent, and child mortality was staggering. Jane's decision to move into this neighborhood wasn't just unconventional, it was considered dangerous and possibly insane by most of her contemporaries. Respectable women didn't live in slums, didn't associate with foreigners and factory workers, and certainly didn't try to solve problems that government officials and religious leaders had declared unsolvable. But Jane had realised something that would guide her entire approach to social reform. You couldn't understand poverty from a distance, and you couldn't solve problems you'd never experienced yourself. Hull House wasn't going to be a charity that distributed assistance from afar. It was going to be a community centre where educated women lived alongside the people they were trying to help. The programs Jane developed at Hull House were revolutionary in their scope and sophistication. She established kindergartens for children whose mothers worked in factories, English classes for adult immigrants, job training programs for young women, and legal aid services for families facing eviction or workplace exploitation. She created an art gallery, a music school, and a theatre program based on the radical idea that poor people deserved beauty and culture, not just food and shelter. But what made Hull House truly groundbreaking was Jane's approach to the relationship between helpers and helped. Instead of seeing the poor as passive recipients of charity, Jane recognized them as people with valuable knowledge, skills, and insights who were trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Hull House programs were designed to build on immigrants' existing capabilities rather than trying to transform them into different kinds of people. Jane's work at Hull House also revealed her genius for understanding how individual problems were connected to larger social and economic systems. She didn't just provide emergency assistance to families in crisis, she investigated the working conditions, housing policies, and political corruption that created those crises in the first place. She was essentially conducting social science research while simultaneously providing direct services. This approach led Jane to become one of America's first systematic critics of industrial capitalism's human costs. Through her daily contact with factory workers, she documented the dangerous working conditions, exploitative wages, and lack of legal protections that were making it impossible for immigrant families to achieve stability and prosperity. She was gathering evidence that would support major reforms in labor law, housing codes, and workplace safety regulations. Jane's refusal to marry wasn't motivated by dislike of men or fear of domestic responsibilities. It was a strategic decision based on her understanding of how marriage would limit her ability to pursue social reform. As a single woman, she could live in Hull House, work irregular hours, travel to investigate social conditions, and take public stands on controversial issues without worrying about a husband's career or children's welfare. But Jane's single status also allowed her to form the kind of deep, supportive relationships with other women that made Hull House's work possible. She lived at Hull House with Ellen Gates Starr, her college friend and co-founder, and later with Mary Rosé Smith, who became her life partner and financial supporter. These relationships weren't just personal friendships, they were professional partnerships that allowed dedicated women to pool their resources and talents in pursuit of social change. The scope of Jane's influence expanded far beyond Hull House, as she became recognized as one of America's leading experts on urban problems and social reform. She wrote books, gave lectures, and consulted with government officials about everything from child labor laws to international peace negotiations. She was proving that women could be not just helpers in social reform, but leaders who shaped public policy and international relations. Jane's approach to social problems was revolutionary because it combined practical assistance with systematic analysis of root causes. She didn't just feed hungry children, she investigated why their parents couldn't earn enough to feed them properly. She didn't just provide temporary shelter for homeless families, she studied the housing policies that made affordable accommodation unavailable to working-class people. This combination of direct service and policy advocacy made Jane one of the most effective reformers of her era. Hull House became a laboratory for testing innovative approaches to education, healthcare, legal aid, and community development that were later adopted by government agencies and social service organizations throughout America. Perhaps most remarkably, Jane's work at Hull House helped establish social work as a legitimate profession for educated women. She proved that helping the poor required sophisticated skills in research, program development, administration, and policy analysis. Skills that women could master as well as men. She was essentially creating career opportunities for future generations of women who wanted to combine their education with meaningful work. Jane's influence culminated in 1931 when she became the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, recognizing her decades of work promoting international cooperation and social justice. She had proven that a woman's decision to remain single and dedicate herself to serving others could have global significance. But while Jane was revolutionizing social work through direct service and systematic reform, our journey through history's most remarkable unmarried women brings us full circle to consider what all these extraordinary lives teach us about independence, purpose, and the courage to choose unconventional paths. Our final chapter explores the lasting legacy of women who refuse to let society's expectations limit their potential. What do a 16th century queen, a medieval mystic, a fashion revolutionary, a beloved novelist, a pioneering scientist, a suffragette, an artist, an educator, a geneticist, an aviator, an economist, a philosopher, a computer visionary, and a social reformer all have in common? They refuse to accept the limitations that society placed on their dreams. As we reach the end of our journey through the lives of history's most remarkable unmarried women, we're left with a profound question. What would our world look like if every generation of women had been free to choose their own paths without apology or explanation? The patterns that emerge from these 14 extraordinary lives reveal something both inspiring and sobering about human potential. Each of these women faced the same fundamental choice: conform to society's expectations and accept the security of traditional roles, or risk everything to pursue their authentic calling. Elizabeth I could have married for a political alliance and dynastic security. Hildegard of Bingen could have remained a quiet nun tending to domestic duties. Coco Chanel could have accepted her position as a wealthy man's mistress and lived comfortably without ever challenging fashion conventions. But they didn't. And that choice, the choice to prioritize authenticity over security, purpose over comfort, contribution over convention, is what transformed them from ordinary individuals into forces of historical change. They understood something that their societies hadn't yet learned: that human potential isn't determined by gender, social class, or the circumstances of birth, but by the courage to envision and pursue possibilities that others can't even imagine. What's fascinating is how each woman's refusal to marry reflected not a rejection of love or partnership, but a sophisticated understanding of what marriage meant in their respective eras. Elizabeth I knew that marriage would mean sharing power and potentially losing control of England. Jane Austen understood that marriage would end her financial independence and creative freedom. Marie Curie recognized that her scientific collaboration with Pierre worked precisely because they were partners by choice, rather than legal obligation. These women weren't anti-marriage, they were pro-autonomy. They were insisting on the right to define their own relationships, careers, and life purposes, rather than accepting definitions imposed by others. In many cases, like Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, or Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz, they created partnerships that were deeper and more supportive than many conventional marriages, because they were based on mutual respect for each other's independence rather than legal or social coercion. The professional achievements of these women become even more remarkable when we consider the obstacles they overcame. Barbara McClintock conducted groundbreaking genetic research while living with constant financial insecurity and professional isolation. Susan B. Anthony faced arrest, ridicule, and death threats for advocating women's voting rights. Amelia Earhart risked her life repeatedly to prove that women could excel in the most dangerous aspects of aviation, but perhaps most importantly, these women understood that their individual choices had implications far beyond their personal lives. They knew they were essentially conducting experiments in human possibility, proving that women could be rulers, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, and reformers. Every success was a victory not just for themselves, but for future generations of women who would benefit from expanded opportunities and changed expectations. The ripple effects of their choices continue to shape our world today. Every time a woman starts a business, pursues advanced education, chooses career over early marriage, or insists on maintaining her identity within a relationship, she's following paths that these historical pioneers made possible. The opportunities that modern women take for granted, the right to vote, to own property, to practice medicine or law, to travel independently, to remain single without social stigma, exist because these remarkable women refused to accept that such things were impossible. What's most inspiring about these stories is how each woman found ways to turn the limitations of her era into sources of strength. Elizabeth I transformed her unmarried status from a political weakness into a diplomatic advantage. Joan Robinson used her position as an academic wife to develop economic theories that revolutionized her field. Ada Lovelace channeled her mathematical obsessions into visions that wouldn't be realized until the computer age. They prove something important about the relationship between individual choice and social change. Transformation happens when people refuse to accept that this is just how things are as a permanent state of affairs. These women looked at the restrictions placed on their gender and essentially said, "We'll see about that." They were willing to be uncomfortable, to face criticism, to risk failure, and to live with uncertainty because they understood that comfort and security aren't worth much if they come at the cost of authenticity and purpose. Their stories also reveal something profound about the nature of legacy. Most of these women died not knowing the full impact of their choices. Elizabeth couldn't have imagined how her model of female leadership would inspire future queens and political leaders. Jane Austen had no idea that her novels would still be beloved and influential 2 centuries later. Barbara McClintock spent decades thinking her genetic discoveries would be forgotten, but they persisted anyway, driven by internal convictions rather than external validation. They understood that meaningful work is worthwhile even if it isn't immediately recognized or rewarded. They were planting seeds for forests they might never see, creating possibilities for people they would never meet. The diversity of their achievements, spanning politics, science, art, literature, economics, philosophy, and social reform, proves that there's no single way to live an unconventional life successfully. What matters isn't the specific path you choose, but the courage to choose a path that reflects your authentic values and capabilities rather than society's expectations. Perhaps most remarkably, these women maintained their humanity and often their sense of humour despite the enormous pressures they faced. Jane Austen's wit sparkled through her social criticism. Coco Chanel's irreverent personality made her as famous as her fashion designs. Amelia Earhart's adventurous spirit inspired people as much as her aviation achievements. They proved that challenging convention doesn't require becoming grim or humourless. Sometimes the most radical act is to remain joyful while pursuing serious goals. Their lives also demonstrate that independence and relationship aren't mutually exclusive. Many of these women formed deep, supportive partnerships with people who shared their values and respected their autonomy. They showed that the choice isn't between love and freedom, but between relationships based on authentic connection and those based on social obligation or economic necessity. As we reflect on these remarkable lives, we're reminded that every generation faces the choice between accepting inherited limitations and creating new possibilities. The specific constraints may change. Modern women face different challenges than their historical predecessors, but the fundamental question remains the same. Will you live according to other people's expectations, or will you have the courage to define success and fulfillment for yourself? These 14 women proved that a life lived authentically, in service of something larger than personal comfort, can have impact far beyond what any individual might imagine. They showed that refusing to accept limitations isn't just a personal choice, it's a gift to future generations who will inherit the expanded possibilities that courage creates. Their legacy reminds us that the most important revolutions often begin not with grand political movements, but with individual people deciding that they deserve better than what they've been told is possible. They were ordinary women who became extraordinary by refusing to accept ordinary limitations on their dreams. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of history's most remarkable unmarried women. These stories remind us that independence, authenticity, and the courage to choose unconventional paths aren't just historical curiosities. They're timeless sources of inspiration for anyone seeking to live a meaningful life. I hope their examples encourage you to examine your own choices and consider what possibilities you might be overlooking because they seem too difficult, too unconventional, or too ambitious. Keep dreaming boldly and remember, the future is created by people who refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in our next historical adventure, where we'll explore another fascinating chapter in the human story of courage, determination, and the endless capacity for growth and change.